Here's a gentle drift into something your brain can actually enjoy tonight. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years being one of TV's most beloved heroes. Then his old boss hired him to destroy that entire image, and the result broke the internet in 2022. The Boys first appeared on Amazon Prime Video back in 2019, and it immediately carved out its own unique space in the superhero genre. By the time Season 3 arrived in June of 2022, the show had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Season 3 pushed things even further than anyone expected, diving deeper into the politics, the satire, the violence, and the character development that fans had come to love. But there's so much more to this season than what you see on screen. The stories behind the stories are just as compelling as the show itself, and tonight we are going to walk through all of them at a pace that's perfect for winding down and drifting off. Let's start with the most talked about element of Season 3, which is the introduction of Herogasm. Now, even if you haven't seen the show, you've probably heard people mention this episode. Herogasm is originally a storyline from the comic books written by Garth Ennis, and for years fans wondered whether the show would ever actually adapt it. When showrunner Eric Kripke and his team finally decided to go for it, they committed completely. The episode titled Herogasm became one of the most discussed and dissected episodes of television in 2022. What's genuinely fascinating is that the production team made a very deliberate and thoughtful decision to approach the content in a way that felt purposeful rather than gratuitous. Kripke talked openly about how they wanted the scene to serve the story and the characters rather than exist purely for shock value. The Homelander versus Soldier Boy versus Butcher confrontation that takes place during that episode is genuinely one of the most intense fight sequences the show has ever produced. Speaking of Soldier Boy, the casting of Jensen Ackles in that role deserves its own conversation. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show that Eric Kripke himself created. So when it came time to cast Soldier Boy, a character who is essentially a toxic, narcissistic, deeply dangerous version of a classic American superhero, Kripke knew exactly who he wanted. There's something beautifully layered about taking an actor who became famous for playing a beloved hero and giving him a role that systematically deconstructs the very idea of heroism. Jensen Ackles threw himself into the part with remarkable dedication. He spent months preparing physically and vocally to embody the character, and the result is a performance that manages to be simultaneously magnetic and genuinely unsettling. The character of Soldier Boy is deeply rooted in American mythology. He's presented as the original superhero, a figure from World War II who became a symbol of American power and exceptionalism. But as Season 3 reveals, almost everything about his legendary status is manufactured. The show uses him as a way to comment on how societies construct heroes, and how those constructions often have nothing to do with the actual people they supposedly represent. Soldier Boy didn't earn his reputation through genuine heroism. He earned it through propaganda, through corporate storytelling, and through the willingness of powerful institutions to promote a useful image regardless of the truth. That's a theme that runs through the entire show, but Season 3 makes it more explicit and more personal than ever before. Now let's talk about the research and development that goes into making this season feel so textured and real despite all its over-the-top elements. The writer's room for The Boys is known for doing extensive research into corporate culture, political messaging, social media dynamics, and the history of celebrity. For Season 3, they dug particularly deep into the mechanics of fascism, propaganda, and the psychology of charismatic authoritarian figures. The way Homelander's arc develops throughout the season is clearly informed by real-world examples of populist leaders who cultivate devoted followings through emotional manipulation and the constant performance of victimhood. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, has spoken in interviews about how he studied various historical and contemporary figures to understand the psychological makeup of someone like that. Anthony Starr's performance in Season 3 is widely considered to be one of the finest acting achievements in the entire run of the show. He finds new layers in Homelander that feel genuinely surprising even for viewers who thought they understood the character completely. The scene where Homelander stands on top of a building and is cheered by a crowd after committing an act of open violence is one of the most disturbing and thought-provoking moments in the season. It's disturbing precisely because it feels believable. It doesn't feel like science fiction or exaggeration. It feels like a logical extension of things we've actually seen happen in the real world. The writers and star worked very carefully together to build that moment properly across multiple episodes so that when it lands, it hits with maximum impact. Now let's drift a little softer, because we're talking about sleep content here and I want to make sure you're settling in nicely. Just take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. The facts we are discussing are interesting, but there's no urgency here. Just let the information float around you gently as you get more comfortable. The production design of Season 3 is extraordinary, and it's something that often gets overlooked in favor of discussing the performances and the storylines. The visual language of the show evolved significantly this season. The Seven's boardroom, Vought Tower, the various locations tied to the history of Compound V, all of these spaces were designed with incredible attention to detail. The art department embedded visual references and symbolic imagery throughout the season that reward close attention. If you've ever paused on certain frames and noticed something unexpected in the background, that's completely intentional. The production designers have talked about how they treat the visual world of the boys like a layer of storytelling that exists independent of the dialogue and action. The costumes in Season 3 are another area where an enormous amount of thought went into every decision. The superhero suits are obviously spectacular and technically demanding, but the civilian clothing is where the costume department gets to do some of their most interesting character work. The way Billy Butcher dresses, for instance, tells you a huge amount about his psychology and his sense of self. The way Homelander's costume has evolved subtly across the seasons reflects his character arc. These aren't accidents. The costume designers work closely with the writers and directors to make sure that what characters wear is reinforcing what the scripts and performances are communicating. Let's talk about the comedy in Season 3 for a moment, because this show does something genuinely difficult, which is balance brutal violence and heavy thematic content with genuinely funny humor. The character of Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and the character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, got a musical number in Season 3 that became one of the most beloved and unexpected moments in the show's history. The sequence, set to a well-known song, is completely absurd and completely charming, and it works because the show has earned the emotional investment in these two characters over multiple seasons. You care about Frenchie and Kimiko deeply by the time that moment arrives, so when it happens, it genuinely delights you rather than feeling like a tonal mistake. Karen Fukuhara has spoken about how much preparation went into that sequence and how meaningful it was for her character's arc. Kimiko is a character who was robbed of her voice in a very literal sense, and the musical number is a fantasy sequence that represents her inner life in a way that the show hadn't been able to access before. It's a genuinely creative storytelling choice that shows the depth of commitment the writers have to every character in the ensemble, not just the headliners. The relationship between Butcher and Huey in Season 3 undergoes some of its most significant development yet. Carl Urban and Jack Quaid have remarkable chemistry that has been one of the show's secret weapons since the beginning, but this season their dynamic gets genuinely complicated in ways that feel emotionally honest. Both characters make choices that are hard to justify and hard to forgive, and the show doesn't ask you to simply understand or excuse those choices. It asks you to sit with the complexity and keep watching. That's a mature approach to storytelling that respects the audience's intelligence and emotional capacity. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey, is the son of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan, which is a piece of trivia that never stops being interesting. He came to the boys as a relatively unknown actor and has used the show as a platform to develop into someone with genuine range and presence. His journey in Season 3 involves experimenting with Compound V to gain temporary powers, and the show uses that storyline to explore questions about masculinity, self-worth, and the dangerous seductiveness of power. Huey wants to feel capable and relevant and strong, and the show is compassionate about that desire while also being clear-eyed about the costs of pursuing power through shortcuts. Now let's ease back a little more. You've been listening for a while now, and hopefully your body is getting heavier and your thoughts are starting to slow down. We're going to keep going, nice and steady, through more of these fascinating details. Just let the words carry you along without holding onto anything too tightly. One of the most technically impressive aspects of Season 3 is the action choreography and the visual effects work. The fight sequences in this season are more elaborate and more viscerally impactful than anything the show had done before. The confrontation at Heragasm and the various battles involving Soldier Boy required months of pre-production planning and collaboration between the stunt team, the visual effects department, and the directors. The show works with a rotating group of directors rather than a single consistent voice, which is a model that requires exceptional coordination. Each director brings their own aesthetic sensibilities to their episodes, but the overall visual consistency is maintained through the work of the producers and the director of photography. The visual effects team on The Boys Season 3 did something genuinely interesting with Soldier Boy's power set. His ability, which involves releasing a powerful energy blast that can suppress other suits' powers, required building a whole new visual language that had to feel distinct from the other powers in the show while still fitting within the established aesthetic. The team drew inspiration from various sources including vintage comic book imagery and Cold War-era nuclear imagery to give his power a specific historical texture. Eric Kripke's role as showrunner deserves special attention because his vision and his voice are what give the show its particular character. Kripke is known for being deeply involved in every aspect of the creative process while also being genuinely collaborative with his writers, directors, and actors. He talks openly about the political intentions of the show and doesn't shy away from being specific about what he's responding to in contemporary culture. This willingness to be direct about the show's satirical targets is somewhat unusual in Hollywood, where projects are often packaged in ambiguity to avoid alienating any potential audience segment. Kripke has made a deliberate choice to be clear about what the boys are saying and to trust that the audience will be receptive to that kind of directness. The show's handling of social media and online celebrity culture in Season 3 is particularly sharp. A-Train's storyline this season involves themes of racial identity and the instrumentalization of social justice messaging for personal and corporate gain. This is a storyline that required careful and thoughtful handling, and the writers worked hard to make sure it felt genuinely considered rather than superficial. The show doesn't offer easy answers about A-Train or his choices. It presents the contradictions and lets the audience wrestle with them. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has spoken about how much the storyline meant to him personally and how he worked closely with the writers to make sure the character's perspective felt authentic. The deep storyline in Season 3 continues to develop in directions that are equal parts comedic and genuinely uncomfortable. Chase Crawford plays the deep with a specific kind of pathetic energy that is really difficult to pull off without becoming cartoonish. The character is simultaneously a predator, a coward, a comic figure, and occasionally someone who seems capable of genuine feeling. The show uses him as a way to explore how institutions protect and enable bad actors, how sycophancy and ambition corrupt people, and how the desperate need for approval can lead someone to do things they might otherwise consider unconscionable. Let's talk about the Black Noir storyline in Season 3 because it goes to some surprising and genuinely poignant places. The character, who had been largely mysterious for the first 2 seasons, gets more interiority this season through flashback sequences that use an interesting stylistic choice involving cartoon characters to represent his inner life. This was a creative decision that could easily have felt gimmicky but instead lands with real emotional weight. The reveal of Black Noir's backstory and his relationship to Soldier Boy adds a new dimension to both characters that recontextualizes things you thought you already understood. Nathan Mitchell, who plays Black Noir, is a physically imposing presence who conveys enormous amounts of emotion through body language alone, which is genuinely demanding work given that the character almost never removes the mask. He has spoken about the challenges and the rewards of performing in a way that relies entirely on physical expression rather than facial expression, and Season 3 gave him some of his most demanding and rewarding material yet. As you're listening to this, hopefully your breathing has slowed down a little. The room is quiet around you. These details about the boys are interesting, but they don't require anything from you right now. You can just let them drift past, catching the ones that interest you, letting the others go. Season 3 of The Boys is 8 episodes long, which is a length that the production team has consistently used across all 3 seasons. This consistency is deliberate. Kripke has talked about his preference for tight, focused seasons that don't allow the narrative to become bloated or repetitive. Each episode in Season 3 runs roughly between 45 and 65 minutes, giving each installment room to breathe while maintaining momentum. The pacing within individual episodes is carefully controlled to balance action, character work, comedy, and thematic content in proportions that feel natural rather than mechanical. The music in The Boys Season 3 is another area where the show does exceptional work. The music supervisor makes choices that are surprising and specific rather than reaching for obvious or safe selections. The way songs are deployed in the show often creates meaning through contrast or irony, placing upbeat or familiar music against images and actions that create a dissonance that's both funny and unsettling. This technique has been used memorably across the entire series, but Season 3 finds new variations on it that feel fresh. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which serves as a convincing stand-in for various American locations. The production team has become expert at transforming Toronto streets and architecture into environments that feel authentically American while taking advantage of Canadian production resources. This is a common practice in television and film production, but The Boys does it particularly effectively, and regular Toronto residents have noted the experience of recognizing local landmarks dressed up as fictional American locations. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 3 is its political satire, and the question of how directly the show is commenting on specific real-world figures and events. The showrunners and writers have been fairly open about their general targets without being so specific that the show becomes a series of one-to-one allegories. The genius of the satire is that it's specific enough to be pointed but broad enough to have resonance beyond any particular moment. This is actually harder to achieve than it sounds. Satire that's too specific becomes dated quickly. Satire that's too general loses its teeth. The Boys threads that needle with notable skill. The casting process for Season 3, particularly for Soldier Boy, involved extensive conversations about what the character needed to accomplish and what kind of actor could bring the necessary combination of physical presence, comedic timing, dramatic weight, and cultural meaning to the role. Jensen Ackles checks all of those boxes and then some. What's particularly interesting is that his character exists in a kind of generational dialogue with Homelander throughout the season. They're both products of Vaught's manufacturing process. They're both performers of a certain kind of American masculinity. But they come from different eras and different templates, and that generational gap between them is one of the richest dramatic tensions the season explores. The writers of The Boys have a background in various genres and traditions, and that diversity of influence shows in the texture of the writing. There are elements of horror, action cinema, political thriller, black comedy, and character drama all operating simultaneously. Managing all of those registers without any of them overwhelming the others is a genuine craft achievement, and Season 3 is probably the best example of the show operating at peak capacity across all of those modes at once. Let's take another gentle pause here. You're doing great. Just breathe. The night is quiet and still, and there's nothing you need to do right now except rest. Let these interesting facts about this fascinating show continue to drift over you as your mind becomes quieter. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most demanding arcs in Season 3. Her character is at the center of some of the season's most emotionally intense moments as she navigates her relationship with Huey, her position within the Seven, and her own evolving sense of identity and purpose. Moriarty has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of the season, and about working closely with the directors and writers to make sure Annie's journey felt internally consistent and emotionally real. Her performance is remarkable for its combination of warmth, vulnerability, and genuine ferocity. The show's approach to violence is something that comes up frequently in discussions about what The Boys is doing aesthetically and ethically. The violence in the show is graphic and it's meant to be uncomfortable. The creative team has been consistent in explaining that they want the violence to have weight and consequence rather than being the kind of bloodless, sanitized violence that dominates most superhero content. By making the violence feel real and costly, the show forces the audience to think about what they're watching in a way that's genuinely useful for the show's thematic purposes. You can't watch The Boys and find the violence entertaining in a simple, uncomplicated way. It always comes with a cost. The relationship between The Boys and the superhero genre more broadly is a genuinely complex one. The show clearly loves superhero stories even as it systematically deconstructs them. Many of the creators and cast members are fans of the genre who see The Boys as a way of engaging with it critically rather than dismissing it. There's a difference between hating something and caring enough about it to examine its assumptions and contradictions. The Boys falls firmly in the latter category, and that genuine engagement with the genre is part of what gives the show its energy and its affection. The production schedule for The Boys Season 3 was complicated by the ongoing effects of the global pandemic, which had disrupted production across the television and film industry. The team adapted to the challenges with considerable flexibility and creativity, and the final product shows no visible evidence of the difficulties they faced. This is a testament to the professionalism and dedication of everyone involved in the production, from the writers and directors to the crew members who made it happen on a practical level every single day. Let's talk for a moment about the fan response to Season 3, because it's genuinely interesting to observe how the audience engaged with the most provocative elements. The Harrigasm episode was watched and discussed by enormous numbers of people who had perhaps been casual fans before and became deeply invested viewers after experiencing what the show was willing to do. The internet response to that episode was a kind of cultural event in itself, with commentary coming from people across the entertainment industry, media, and general public. The showrunners had anticipated a strong reaction, but the scale of the conversation surprised even them. The show's use of social media as part of its promotional strategy has been particularly clever. The Vought International account, which presents itself as though it's the real social media presence of the fictional corporation from the show, has become a beloved part of the fan experience. The content posted on these accounts extends the world of the show into real social media spaces in a way that's both funny and thought-provoking, given that the show is partly about the power of social media and corporate messaging. It's the show practicing what it preaches in a way that demonstrates genuine self-awareness. The critical response to Season 3 was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise directed at the performances, the writing, and the show's willingness to continue taking risks rather than settling into a comfortable formula. Shows that make it to a third season often become more cautious as they try to protect what they've built, but The Boys actually became more ambitious and more confident with each passing season. That's a pattern that's relatively rare in television, and it's worth noting as one of the show's significant achievements. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes detail from Season 3 involves the writing of the Homelander storyline. The writers have described the process of mapping out his arc as requiring them to constantly think about real-world historical examples of how charismatic but dangerous figures build and maintain power. They read extensively in history and political science to understand the mechanics of what Homelander is doing, which is why his manipulation of public sentiment feels so disturbingly credible. Anthony Starr then took that research and grounded it in an incredibly specific, technically precise performance that never tips over into caricature. The Boys exists in a tradition of satirical fiction that includes everything from Network to DR. Strangelove to Don't Look Up, works that use exaggeration and dark humor to illuminate uncomfortable truths about how power operates and how ordinary people respond to it. What makes The Boys distinctive within that tradition is the combination of its mainstream appeal, its superhero trappings, and its genuine emotional depth. It reaches people who might not normally engage with explicitly political satire because it wraps its arguments in an enormously entertaining package. You're still here, which is wonderful. Hopefully you're quite relaxed by now, maybe drifting a little. That's perfectly fine. Just let the last few details wash over you gently as we wind down this conversation about a show that has so much more going on beneath its spectacular surface. The character of Victoria Newman, played by Claudia Dumet, becomes even more important in Season 3 as her true allegiances and capabilities become clearer. The character is a brilliantly constructed piece of satire about political ambition and the way institutions protect people who are useful to them regardless of what those people have done. Dumet brings a specific kind of controlled intensity to the role that makes Newman consistently compelling even when the character is doing things that are difficult to watch. The show's writers have consistently said that they want the show to be genuinely funny as well as genuinely disturbing, and Season 3 achieves that balance probably better than any previous season. The comedy never undercuts the drama, and the drama never makes the comedy feel inappropriate. They exist simultaneously because that's how life actually works. The most intense and the most absurd things can occupy the same moment, and the ability to reflect that truth is one of the markers of genuinely sophisticated storytelling. As we draw close to the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating details of The Boys Season 3, I want to leave you with something to think about as you drift off into sleep. The show is ultimately about accountability and the absence of it. It's about what happens when power is allowed to operate without consequences, when the stories we tell about strength and heroism are manufactured rather than earned, and when ordinary people try to find ways to hold extraordinary power responsible. Those are questions that have always mattered and will always matter, which is why the show resonates so deeply with so many people. The craft and care that went into Season 3, from the performances to the writing to the visual effects to the production design, represents a remarkable collective achievement. Television is a collaborative medium, and The Boys is one of the best recent examples of what's possible when talented people work together with genuine ambition and genuine respect for their audience. So let that be where we leave things tonight. The lights are low. The information has settled around you like something soft and familiar. You know a little more now about how one of television's most interesting shows was made and what it was trying to do. And there's nothing left for you to do tonight except let your thoughts grow quieter and your breathing grow slower and let the rest of the night carry you somewhere peaceful. Sleep well. You've earned it. Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, maybe a little too tired to watch anything but not quite tired enough to actually fall asleep. Your brain is still buzzing. You need something interesting. Something that pulls you in without demanding too much from you. Something that rewards you for just listening. Well, tonight you are in exactly the right place. Because we are diving deep into one of the most brilliantly written, shockingly creative, and genuinely underrated seasons of television ever made. Season 2 of The Boys. And whether you watched it when it first dropped or you've seen it a dozen times, I promise you there are things about this season that will genuinely surprise you. Details you probably missed. Behind-the-scenes stories that make the whole thing even more impressive. And facts that reveal just how much thought went into every single frame. So get comfortable. Settle in. And let's talk about The Boys Season 2 in a way you've never heard before. Let's start with the thing that makes Season 2 so remarkable compared to its predecessor. When Season 1 dropped, nobody really knew what to expect. The Boys arrived as this loud, irreverent, politically charged antidote to superhero fatigue, and audiences were genuinely shocked by how far it was willing to go. But here's the thing about shock value. It only works once. The second time around, you can't just do the same tricks. You have to evolve. And the creative team behind The Boys understood that completely. Season 2 wasn't just more of the same. It was a deliberate deepening of everything the show was trying to say. The satire got sharper. The characters got more complex. And the storytelling became genuinely layered in ways that rewarded close attention. One of the most fascinating aspects of Season 2 is how it handled the introduction of Stormfront. And let me tell you, the casting of Aya Cash in that role was one of the most inspired decisions the show ever made. Before The Boys, Aya Cash was perhaps best known for her comedic work, and that background turned out to be absolutely crucial to how the character worked. Stormfront is terrifying precisely because she's charming. She's funny. She's relatable. She speaks in this casual, internet-savvy language that makes her feel like someone you might actually follow on social media. And that is the point. The show was using her character to make a very specific and very pointed argument about how modern extremism operates. It doesn't announce itself with a red flag and a manifesto. It comes wrapped in humor and charisma and relatability. The fact that Aya Cash could deliver that performance with such precision while also making it feel completely natural is genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. The character of Stormfront in the original comic books is actually a male character. A fairly straightforward neo-Nazi villain without the kind of complexity or social commentary layered into the television version. The decision to reimagine that character as a woman, and specifically to frame her as this social media savvy, image-conscious, deeply manipulative figure, was a creative choice made specifically for the show, and it transformed what could have been a one-note antagonist into something that actually says something real about the world we live in. The showrunners were looking at the rise of online radicalization and the way that certain ideological movements had learned to rebrand themselves using the aesthetics of progressivism and internet culture. Stormfront is the fictional embodiment of that very real phenomenon. Let's talk about Karl Urban for a moment, because Billy Butcher is one of the great performances currently on television, and Season 2 really pushed that character into new territory. What a lot of people don't know is that Karl Urban brings a lot of himself to that role. The physicality, the accent, the sheer intensity of how he inhabits Butcher. There's a rawness to it that doesn't feel entirely performed. Urban has talked about finding the character's anger very accessible because the things Butcher is angry about, the abuse of power, the corruption of institutions, the way ordinary people get ground up by systems designed to protect the powerful, those are things that genuinely resonate with him. Season 2 in particular gave Urban some of the most emotionally demanding material of his entire career, particularly in the scenes involving Butcher's wife Becca and his complicated relationship with her son Ryan. Watching Butcher navigate that relationship is watching a man who has built his entire identity around hatred suddenly confronted with the possibility that love might require something more from him. The character of Ryan, who is Homelander's biological son, is another element that Season 2 uses with remarkable intelligence. Because Ryan is not a villain. He is a child. A deeply confused, genuinely frightened child who has been raised in complete isolation by a mother who is trying to protect him from both Vought and from his own father. The show never lets you forget that. Even as Homelander becomes increasingly unhinged and the threat he represents becomes more acute, Ryan remains this figure of pure innocence caught in the middle. And the way Season 2 explores the idea that children can be either the best or worst thing that happens to someone like Homelander, that his son could either redeem him or destroy whatever was left of his humanity, is genuinely sophisticated storytelling. Speaking of Homelander, Anthony Starr's performance in Season 2 is something that genuinely deserves to be studied. There is a scene in the season where Homelander is alone, standing on a rooftop, and he begins laughing and crying simultaneously in this way that is profoundly disturbing. It communicates everything you need to know about where this character is psychologically without a single word of dialogue. Anthony Starr has spoken about the research he did for the role, looking at how narcissistic personality disorder manifests, how people who have never developed a secure sense of identity behave when that identity is threatened. Season 2 is really where that research pays off most visibly, because the threat to Homelander's identity in this season isn't external. It's internal. He is forced to confront the fact that he might not actually be the good guy he has always needed to believe he was. Now let's talk about something that comes up a lot when people discuss The Boys, and that is the show's relationship to real superhero franchises. The satire is obviously pointed at the MCU and DCU in general terms, but Season 2 gets quite specific. The idea of superheroes being used to justify military intervention, the manipulation of public perception around supers being deployed overseas, the congressional hearings about superhero accountability, all of this is clearly in conversation with real debates that were happening in American political culture at the time. And the show doesn't pretend to be neutral about any of it. The Boys has a point of view, and Season 2 sharpens that point of view considerably. The superheroes in this show are not metaphors for something vague. They are very specific metaphors for corporate power, for the military-industrial complex, for media manipulation, and for the way celebrity culture insulates the powerful from accountability. Here's a fascinating production detail that most viewers have no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. And yet it needs to convincingly depict New York City, various American small towns, government buildings, and corporate headquarters. The production design team on The Boys is working at an extraordinarily high level to make Toronto stand in for all of these locations, and Season 2 in particular required some incredibly creative problem-solving to pull off certain key sequences. The city of Toronto and its surrounding areas have a remarkable flexibility as a filming location, but matching the specific visual language of New York requires a level of attention to detail that the show's crew has become almost legendary for delivering. Let's shift to talking about deep, because the arc that Chase Crawford is given in Season 2 is one of the most underrated storytelling choices the entire show has made. Deep was introduced in Season 1 as a fairly simple villain, a harasser who uses his position of power to exploit women and faces no consequences. Season 2 recontextualizes that character in a genuinely unexpected way. It doesn't excuse what he did, not even slightly, but it does explore the psychology of how someone ends up becoming that kind of person. The Church of the Collective subplot, which is clearly modeled on Scientology, is used to examine how predatory organizations exploit people who are already damaged, who are already desperate for belonging and validation. Deep is pathetic in Season 2, and that is precisely the point. The show is asking you to understand him without asking you to forgive him. The Gills scene. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you're in for quite a surprise. There is a scene in Season 2 involving Deep's Gills that is among the most audacious, genuinely strange pieces of television I've ever encountered. It manages to be simultaneously absurd and emotionally sincere, which is a combination almost no other show has ever successfully achieved. What's remarkable about that scene is that it actually advances the character. It's not shock for shock's sake. The scene is about Deep confronting his own body, his own identity, his own sense of self-worth, through this deeply weird lens. The fact that the writers found a way to use something so bizarre to say something genuine about body image and self-acceptance is a testament to how carefully the show is actually constructed. Now let me tell you something about the writing process for Season 2 that really illuminates why the season feels so cohesive. The writer's room for The Boys operates somewhat differently from many other prestige television shows. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who also created Supernatural, has talked about the importance of having writers in the room who come from very different political and cultural backgrounds. The show doesn't want an echo chamber. It wants genuine debate about what the satire should be targeting, how far to push things, what actually constitutes meaningful commentary versus mere provocation. Season 2 in particular benefited from this approach because it was dealing with subject matter, the rise of white nationalist movements, online radicalization, media complicity and extremism, that required a nuanced and thoughtful approach to avoid either trivializing the issue or becoming preachy about it. Eric Kripke has been remarkably candid in interviews about the fact that the show often writes itself into positions that make him personally uncomfortable. Not because the content is gratuitous, but because the satire forces him to examine things he would rather not examine. The character of Homelander, for example, has become in some corners of the internet a figure of admiration rather than horror. Fans who identify with his worldview, who see his contempt for ordinary people and his rage at those who would constrain him as something aspirational. Kripke has said that this is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most validating response to the show, because it confirms that what they're depicting is real and present in the culture, not something they've invented. Let's talk about the finale of Season 2, because it contains one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire run. The scene where a character's head explodes. I'll try to keep this relatively spoiler light for anyone who might somehow be hearing this before watching. But that moment is not just a shock gag. It is the culmination of an entire season's worth of thematic work about the limits of corruption, about what happens when systems designed to manage dangerous people fail, and about the way violence has a way of turning back on those who use it as a tool. The visual effects team on that sequence spent an enormous amount of time getting the practicalities right, but more importantly, the writers spent enormous care setting up the emotional and narrative logic that makes the moment land as more than just gross spectacle. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating about Season 2 from a structural perspective. It is a season about exposure. Almost every major character arc in the season involves some version of a secret being threatened. Vaught's secrets about Compound v Homelander's secret about Becca and Ryan. Stormfront's secret history. The boys own secrets from each other. Even secondary characters like A-Train and Maeve are navigating questions about what happens when the lies they've been living start to unravel. The entire season operates around this central anxiety about revelation, about what it costs to keep things hidden and what it costs when they come to light. And this is not an accident. The theme is consistent from the first episode to the last, woven into every storyline simultaneously. Now here's a behind-the-scenes detail that really changed how I thought about the show. The costume design on The Boys is doing things that are easy to miss on a first watch. The soup costumes are designed to look like what a corporate marketing team would create if they were trying to sell heroism as a brand, not to evoke actual functionality or power. The textures, the colors, the little branding details. All of it is designed to read as product first and as superhero costume second. But in Season 2, there's a subtle evolution in some of the costumes that tracks character development. Starlight's costume in particular goes through changes that mirror her psychological journey through the season, her increasing resistance to Vaught's control, her reclamation of her own identity. These changes were entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue joins the cast in Season 2 as Madeline Stillwell's replacement, and the character of Ashley brings something that the show really needed at that point in its run. A corporate villain who is just trying to survive, who isn't ideologically committed to anything beyond her own advancement, and who therefore represents the most common and perhaps most dangerous kind of complicity. Ashley isn't a true believer. She's just someone who has decided that the cost of resistance is too high. And watching her navigate the impossible demands of managing superheroes who could vaporize her with a look is both terrifying and darkly funny in exactly the right measure. Let me tell you about the music in Season 2, because this is another element that doesn't get nearly enough credit. The show's music supervisor has an almost supernatural ability to find needle-drop moments that recontextualize both the songs and the scenes they're placed in. There is a particular sequence in Season 2 set to a classic piece of music where the juxtaposition between the wholesome familiarity of the song and the absolute carnage unfolding on screen creates this vertiginous feeling that is entirely unique to The Boys. The show understands that music is not just mood enhancement. It's commentary. The song choices in The Boys are always saying something about the scene they're soundtracking. Something that I want to highlight specifically for anyone who appreciates craft in storytelling is the way Season 2 handles the character of Mother's Milk. Laz Alonso gets some of the best material of his career in this season, and what makes it work is the tension between MM's desperate need for order and control, his meticulous, careful, methodical approach to everything, and the absolute chaos that defines his life as part of The Boys. Season 2 gives him a family subplot that grounds all of his psychological quirks in something emotionally real. His obsessive tendencies aren't played for comedy. They're shown as survival mechanisms developed by someone who has been unable to prevent terrible things from happening to people he loves. That's rich, careful character work. Now I want to spend some time on a detail that really reflects the show's commitment to internal consistency. The world of The Boys has its own internal logic around how powers work, how Compound V functions, and how the Vought Corporation has structured its entire operation around managing and monetizing these abilities. Season 2 expands this worldview significantly. The congressional hearings about soups, the revelation about Compound V being given to people in other countries, the corporate and political machinery around all of this. It's extraordinarily detailed world building that rewards attention. The show clearly has documents, timelines, and histories for this world that never make it onto screen but that inform every decision the writers make. Here's something that might make you appreciate the show on a different level. The Boys films its more extreme violence and its more provocative content with a deliberate aesthetic that is meant to be uncomfortable rather than exciting. This is an intentional choice. In most action movies and superhero films, violence is choreographed to be cool. The camera angles, the editing rhythms, the sound design all work together to make it feel thrilling. The Boys deliberately subverts this. When violence happens in The Boys, it usually looks wrong. The camera doesn't glorify it. The editing makes it feel sudden and unglamorous. The sound design emphasizes the wet, physical reality of what's happening. This is the show making an argument with its filmmaking language about how we've been trained to consume violence as entertainment. Let's talk about the ending of Season 2 and what it sets up. Without going into too much detail, the season ends with Homelander in a genuinely interesting place. He has not been defeated. In fact, in some ways he has consolidated power. But his psychology has shifted. He has been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities in ways that he has not fully processed. And the dynamic with Ryan represents both his greatest potential weakness and his most dangerous new motivation. Season 3 of The Boys picks up threads from everything Season 2 planted, but the seeds are all right there in the final episodes of the second season if you know what to look for. One thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of The Boys is the performance of Jack Quaid as Huey Campbell. Huey is the audience surrogate character, the everyman who serves as our entry point into this world of superpowered horror. But Jack Quaid finds unexpected depths in what could have been a purely functional role. In Season 2 particularly, Huey goes through a crisis of his own effectiveness. He starts to question whether he is actually useful to the boys or whether he's just tagging along. And the choices he makes as a result of that crisis, some of them very wrong choices, feel earned because of the groundwork Quaid has been laying since episode 1. There's a really interesting piece of trivia about the casting process for The Boys that relates to Season 2 specifically. When they were searching for the right person to play Stormfront, the casting team reportedly went through an extensive search looking for someone who could thread a very specific needle. The character needed to be immediately likable. She needed to have the kind of warmth and charisma that makes you want to trust her. But there also needed to be something just slightly off, just barely perceptible, that a careful viewer might catch on a rewatch. Aya Cash nailed this so completely that several people involved in production have said they occasionally had to remind themselves during filming that the character was the villain. Now here is a piece of context that I think is genuinely important for understanding Season 2 and why it landed the way it did. The season was released in 2020, during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American and global history. The conversations the show was having about extremism, about institutional corruption, about the relationship between media and truth, these were not abstract conversations. They were conversations that were happening in real time, right alongside the show. And the creative team has talked about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable experience of watching their satire feel less like exaggeration and more like documentary as the year unfolded. That context of release doesn't just make the show feel prescient. It helps explain why it resonated so deeply with so many viewers. Let me tell you about the practical effects work in Season 2, because this show uses more practical effects than most people realize. The production takes a hybrid approach, combining CGI with practical elements in ways that keep things grounded. The gore, for instance, is frequently practical. The decision to use real practical effects for many of the show's more extreme physical moments is part of what gives the violence its particular quality of wrongness, that feeling that what you're seeing couldn't quite have been manufactured. There's a texture to practical effects that CGI still struggles to replicate perfectly, and the production designer and special effects coordinator on The Boys have been quite deliberate about preserving that texture. Something worth discussing is how Season 2 handles the representation of trauma, particularly among its female characters. Season 1 was criticized in some quarters for how it depicted sexual violence, with some arguing that it was too explicit, that it was using assault as a plot device rather than engaging meaningfully with its consequences. Season 2 responds to that criticism in interesting ways. The show is more thoughtful about giving its female characters agency in how they process and respond to what has been done to them. Maeve's arc in particular, her refusal to be used as a tool anymore regardless of the personal cost, feels like the show working through and deepening its approach to these themes. The show also does something really interesting with A-Train in Season 2. A-Train is not a sympathetic character. He made a terrible choice in Season 1 and then made it worse with his subsequent choices. But Season 2 gives him a storyline that forces you to hold two things at once simultaneously: his villainy and his victimhood. Because A-Train is also someone who has been exploited, who has been built up and then discarded by Vought, who has had his identity and his community weaponized against him. The show doesn't use this to forgive him, but it does use it to make the world feel more textured and real, because in the real world, people are frequently both. Here's a final behind-the-scenes detail that I love. The script for the season finale was rewritten multiple times right up until filming began, and even after filming began, certain elements were adjusted based on what the cast was bringing to the material. The performers on this show, particularly Anthony Starr and Carl Urban, are doing things with their characters that consistently surprise the writers and push them to find new angles. Television at its best is a collaborative art form, and The Boys Season 2 is a really beautiful example of what happens when you put genuinely talented people in a room together and give them the freedom and the trust to follow the work wherever it leads. What makes The Boys Season 2 ultimately so enduring as a piece of television is that it takes its audience seriously. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't pretend the world is simpler than it is. It looks directly at some of the most complicated and uncomfortable aspects of contemporary culture: the way we manufacture heroes, the way we consume outrage, the way power insulates itself from consequence, and it finds a way to make all of that viscerally entertaining without blunting the critique. That combination is extraordinarily rare. Shows that are genuinely funny, genuinely scary, genuinely provocative, and genuinely thoughtful at the same time don't come along very often. And the fact that Season 2 managed to raise the bar set by an already excellent first season is the thing that really cements its legacy. It would have been so easy to simply do more of the same. More blood, more shock, more outrage. But instead, the show chose to do something harder and more interesting. It chose to grow, to complicate, to ask harder questions and resist easier answers. Season 2 is where The Boys became not just a great genre show, but an actually important piece of popular culture. Something that was genuinely in conversation with its moment in a way that very few things achieve. So the next time you're drifting off and you want something interesting to think about, something that rewards the way your brain works when it's just slightly untethered from the demands of full consciousness, think about Stormfront and what she says about how modern extremism sells itself. Think about Homelander crying and laughing on that rooftop and what that tells you about the psychology of people who never learn to be accountable. Think about Butcher standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew, looking at a little boy he didn't ask for, and choosing to be better than he has any natural inclination to be. The Boys Season 2 is not just great television. It's a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is they show you things you can't see any other way. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake up, watch it again. Picture this. You're lying in bed, the room is dark, and your mind just won't stop racing. You need something to pull your focus away from the noise of the day, but you don't want anything too intense, nothing that's going to spike your adrenaline or keep you wide awake. What you need is a calm, steady voice walking you through fascinating little details about a world you love. And if that world happens to be The Boys, one of the most creative, wildly imaginative television universes ever built, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. We're just going to talk about this incredible show, the hidden layers underneath it, the fascinating connections, the little facts that make the whole thing feel even richer. There's no pressure here. Just settle in and let the words wash over you. The Boys as a television series didn't start from nowhere. It came from a comic book written by Garth Ennis, which was itself a pretty wild and darkly satirical take on what the world might look like if superheroes actually existed and were managed by a massive corporation. But when Eric Kripke adapted it for television, he brought something completely unique to it. Now here's what makes that interesting in a sleepy sort of way. Eric Kripke isn't just the showrunner of The Boys. He's also the creator of another enormously beloved television series called Supernatural, which ran for 15 full seasons and developed one of the most devoted fan followings in television history. So when you watch The Boys, you are watching something created by the same mind that built that entire other universe. Two very different worlds, same creative fingerprint running through both of them. And because of that connection, The Boys has quietly become something of a reunion place for actors who spent years working on Supernatural. Jensen Ackles, who plays the character Soldier Boy on The Boys, is probably the most famous example of this. He played one of the two lead characters on Supernatural for the entire run of the show. But he's not alone. Many of the actors and people involved in The Boys passed through Supernatural at some point along the way. This creates a kind of invisible thread that runs beneath the surface of The Boys, connecting it to all those years of supernatural storytelling. For fans who know both shows, watching The Boys sometimes feels like a homecoming in the most unexpected and wonderful way. Let's drift a little deeper into the world of Soldier Boy specifically, because his character is one of the most layered and quietly tragic figures in the entire show. On the surface, He comes across as a brutish relic from another era, a man out of time in the worst possible way, someone who holds onto outdated ideas and throws his weight around with zero self-awareness. But underneath that, there are these small, almost tender moments that keep slipping through. His relationship with Homelander, for instance, slowly develops into something that feels genuinely paternal, which is deeply ironic given how monstrous both of them can be. Watching two people who are essentially walking disasters find some kind of father and son connection is one of those things that only the boys could pull off without it feeling absurd. Homelander himself is one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in recent television history, and there's something almost meditative about thinking through who he actually is when you strip away all the laser eyes and the cape. At his core, he is a deeply abandoned person. He grew up in a laboratory. He had no parents, no family, no genuine human connection. Everything he knows about love and belonging came from the outside world watching him from behind glass, or from a public that worships him without actually knowing him. And that worship became the thing he built his entire identity around. So when that worship feels threatened, or when someone gets close enough to make him feel something real, he can't handle it. The vulnerability terrifies him. And so he destroys it. There's something almost unbearably human about that, even though he is clearly portrayed as a villain. The show never lets you forget that monsters are made, not born. Now let's think about the corporation at the center of everything, Vought International. The writers built Vought as a satire of corporate America in the most elaborate and detailed way. They have their own media empire, their own film studio, their own product lines, their own political connections. They've essentially made superheroes into a brand, and that brand is worth more to them than anything else, including the actual human beings involved. The dark satirical twist is that this doesn't feel that far from reality. The way celebrity is managed, the way public image is constructed and protected, the way corporations will sacrifice individuals to preserve their reputation. The Boys takes all of that and just turns the volume up to an almost unbearable degree. And yet somehow, the closer you look at it, the more familiar it starts to feel. One of the quieter and more interesting creative choices the show makes is how it handles its in-universe media. There are advertisements, movies, news broadcasts, social media posts, merchandise, all existing within the world of the show as if this is just the normal backdrop of life. The in-universe film called Dawn of the Seven, for example, is treated within the show as a massive blockbuster production, with all the behind-the-scenes drama and ego conflicts you would expect from a real Hollywood production. This layering of fictional media within the show's already fictional world creates a strange depth to everything. You start to understand how these characters are perceived by the ordinary public who can't see what we see as the audience. The gap between public image and private reality is one of the central tensions the show keeps returning to again and again. Let's talk about the character of Sage for a moment, because she is one of the most quietly unsettling people in the entire series. She is presented as the smartest person alive, someone whose intelligence is so vast that it becomes its own kind of curse. Her backstory involves a grandmother who loved her, a medical establishment that dismissed her, and a grief that eventually curdled into something deeply cold. She doesn't want power for the reasons most people want power. She doesn't want fame or control or adoration. What she actually wants is to be left alone. And she has come to believe that the only way the world will ever leave her alone is if it essentially tears itself apart. That is a specific kind of nihilism that the show presents not as cartoonish villainy but as something that grew organically from real pain. It's disturbing precisely because you can trace the emotional logic of it even if the conclusion is monstrous. The reference the show makes to a famous episode of The Twilight Zone is particularly rich for those who catch it. In that old black and white episode, a bookworm who just wants peace and quiet to read survives a nuclear apocalypse and finally has all the time in the world to read every book he's ever wanted. And then his glasses break. It's one of the most heartbreaking ironic endings in all of classic television. The connection to Sage's plan in The Boys is genuinely clever, because it raises the same question. Even if she gets what she wants, even if the world burns and she's left in silence, will it actually give her what she's looking for? Or will there be some equally devastating irony waiting for her at the end? Now let's drift towards something a little lighter. The comedy in The Boys is something that deserves its own moment of appreciation. The show is technically a dark superhero satire, but it operates with a very specific comedic sensibility that goes far beyond simple parody. There are jokes layered inside jokes, cultural references folded into absurdist situations, and a willingness to go to places that most television writers would never dare approach. What keeps it from feeling gratuitous is that the comedy usually serves a purpose. The most outrageous moments are often also the most pointed criticisms of something real. The grossness is frequently the point. When something makes you recoil and laugh at the same time, you're being forced to confront your own reaction, which is exactly what good satire should do. Terra, Butcher's dog, is one of those details that the show uses with surprising emotional depth. On the surface, a dog who behaves exactly the way Terra behaves is just pure comedy. But within the context of the show, the dog represents something about Butcher himself. Butcher is a man who has burned almost every meaningful human connection in his life. He is abrasive and ruthless and self-destructive in ways that push people away. But the dog stays. The dog doesn't care about any of that. And the scenes between Butcher and Terra carry this quiet emotional weight that sneaks up on you if you let it. The show uses that animal connection to remind you that even the most damaged people have some corner of themselves where something soft still lives. The relationship between Kimiko and Frenchie is another one of those emotional cores that the show returns to throughout its run. Kimiko doesn't speak in the traditional sense for much of the series, and yet her relationship with Frenchie is one of the most communicative and emotionally alive connections in the whole show. They understand each other without words in ways that the more verbally expressive characters never quite manage. There's a tenderness between them that exists in contrast to all the violence surrounding them. And the show is smart enough to complicate that tenderness too, to let it feel fragile and uncertain in the way real relationships do, rather than just presenting it as a safe harbor in a storm. Here's an interesting little detail about the world building that doesn't always get talked about. The show takes great care to establish its own internal history, its own mythology about how superheroes came to exist and how Vought built its empire around them. References to past decades, to earlier generations of heroes, to experiments and cover-ups and historical events that Vought quietly influenced. This isn't just window dressing. It creates a sense that the world of The Boys has been going on long before we arrive to watch it, and will continue in some form after the story ends. That historical depth is part of what makes the fictional corporation feel so believably menacing. They didn't build this overnight. This is the result of decades of careful, deliberate manipulation. The character of Starlight, Annie January, sits at a very specific intersection that the show finds particularly interesting. She came into the Seven as someone who genuinely believed in the possibility of being a hero, of using extraordinary abilities to do actual good. She wasn't naive exactly, but she was idealistic in a way that the world of the show immediately began attacking from every direction. Watching her hold onto pieces of that idealism while also becoming something harder and more practical is one of the ongoing emotional journeys of the series. She represents the question of whether it's possible to maintain your values inside a corrupt system, or whether the system always wins eventually. Mother's Milk is one of those characters where the show does something genuinely thoughtful with motivation. His reasons for being in the fight against Vought are deeply personal, connected to family history and loss in ways that make his commitment feel grounded in something real rather than abstract heroism. And the show pays attention to how that personal history shapes the way he sees the larger mission. He's not fighting for some general idea of justice. He's fighting for something specific and human, which is ultimately what makes him one of the most relatable people in a cast of characters who are frequently operating at the extreme edges of human behavior. Think for a moment about how the show handles power specifically, physical superhuman power, and what it does to people psychologically. Almost every superhero in The Boys who has significant power has been damaged by it in some way. Either they were given it too young, or under circumstances that were traumatic, or in a context where the power was immediately used to corrupt rather than protect. The show seems to argue pretty consistently that power in the hands of people who haven't developed the emotional and moral framework to use it responsibly is one of the most dangerous things imaginable. which maps directly onto critiques of real-world power structures, even without the supernatural element. There's something deeply satisfying about how the show builds and releases tension across episodes. It doesn't follow a predictable rhythm. You can be deep in a comedic sequence and then suddenly something genuinely affecting happens. Or you can be braced for something terrible and the show pivots into absurdist humor instead. This unpredictability is part of what keeps people watching, but it also creates a specific emotional experience where you're never quite settled, never quite sure what register the show is operating in at any given moment. Which, when you think about it, is also what living inside a world with unchecked powerful people might actually feel like. The satirical targets of The Boys are broad in scope but consistent in their angle of attack. Corporate greed, celebrity worship, religious manipulation, political opportunism, media complicity. These aren't separate themes that the show visits occasionally. They're woven together into a single interconnected critique of how power operates in modern society. And the show does this without ever becoming preachy, which is genuinely difficult. The secret is that the satire is always expressed through character and situation rather than through direct statement. Nobody steps up to deliver a lecture. The critique lives in what happens, in the consequences characters face, in the gaps between what characters say and what they actually do. Let's close out this evening with the idea that makes The Boys perhaps most interesting as a thought experiment. The superheroes in this show are not heroes in any meaningful sense. They are celebrities who happen to have extraordinary abilities. The corporation treats them as products. The public treats them as gods. And many of them have come to believe the mythology built around them. The question the show quietly asks underneath all the chaos and violence and dark comedy is a simple one. What would it actually take to hold power accountable? And the answer the show keeps returning to is that it takes ordinary people refusing to stop, even when the cost is enormous, even when the odds are completely ridiculous, even when it seems like the forces aligned against them are simply too vast and too entrenched to ever be moved. That's not a comfortable answer. But it's an honest one. And on that note, you can let all of that settle gently into the back of your mind, into that place where the thoughts get quieter and the body gets heavier and the night wraps around you like something familiar and warm. There's nothing more to figure out tonight. The world of The Boys will still be there tomorrow, full of its wild characters and impossible situations and hidden layers waiting to be noticed. But right now, this moment is just for resting. So breathe slowly, let the thoughts drift off one by one, and drift gently into sleep knowing you've spent these quiet minutes well. Look, I've been watching superhero content for years. I've sat through every Marvel phase, every DC reboot, every streaming disaster. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go quite like The Boys. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Most people think they know this show. They've watched it, they've talked about it, they've argued about it online. But I promise you, by the time this video ends, you're going to realize you barely scratched the surface of what's actually going on beneath the layers of blood, satire, and absolute chaos that makes this show one of the most brilliant pieces of television ever created. So stay with me, because some of what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you watch every single episode again. Let's start with something that sounds simple but is actually one of the most deliberately crafted decisions the show has ever made. The name Vought International is not random. The creators drew inspiration from real defense contractors and entertainment conglomerates to build a company that feels disturbingly familiar. Vought is essentially a composite nightmare of every major corporation you've ever had a complicated relationship with. It sells the idea of superheroes the same way a fast food chain sells the idea of happiness. The product looks amazing in the marketing. The reality is something entirely different. And that deliberate parallel to modern corporate America is baked into every single logo placement, every press conference, every smile Homelander flashes for the cameras. Now here's where things get really interesting. Carl Urban, the man who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most beloved characters in the entire show, almost didn't take the role. He had serious reservations. Not because he didn't love the character, but because he wasn't sure the show could actually pull off what it was attempting to do. The source material, the original comic series written by Garth Ennis, is genuinely extreme. We are talking about content that makes even the most shocking moments in the show look like a warm-up. Urban needed to be convinced that the television adaptation would find the right balance between being genuinely provocative and being gratuitous for no reason. Once the showrunner Eric Kripke got him on the phone and laid out the vision, Urban was in. And if you've ever watched Urban in an interview talking about Butcher, you can see that he didn't just take a job. He took on an identity. Speaking of Carl Urban, did you know that his accent in the show required more preparation than almost any other aspect of his performance? Urban is from New Zealand. Billy Butcher is from London's East End. Those are not remotely similar sounds. Urban worked with dialect coaches for an extended period before filming began, and he has spoken in interviews about how he essentially had to rebuild the way he physically forms words to make Butcher sound authentic. What's fascinating is that the accent itself becomes a character. There's a roughness to it, a working-class aggression that tells you everything about where Butcher came from before you even learn his backstory. That's not accident. That's craft. But let's talk about the character who arguably carries the most psychological weight in the entire show. Homelander. Played with terrifying precision by Anthony Starr, a New Zealand actor who, much like Urban, had to completely shed his natural voice and presence to inhabit this role. What most people don't realize is that Homelander was specifically designed to be a deconstruction of Superman, but not the cynical kind of deconstruction that just makes a hero evil for shock value. The writers wanted to ask a genuinely disturbing question. What would a person actually be like if they grew up with those abilities, in that kind of isolation, subjected to that kind of experimental pressure from birth, with no normal human development, no genuine love, no real sense of consequence? The answer they arrived at is Homelander. And it's horrifying because it makes sense. Anthony Starr has talked extensively about the preparation that went into Homelander psychology. He based elements of the character on research into narcissistic personality disorder, abandonment trauma, and the specific psychological profiles of cult leaders. That smile that Homelander does, the one that sends chills down your spine even when he's supposed to be doing something heroic, that was developed intentionally. Starr described it as the smile of someone who has learned that smiling gets you what you want, but who doesn't actually feel what the smile is supposed to represent. It's a mask that occasionally slips. And when it slips, that's when you see what's underneath. And what's underneath is something that didn't get enough of the right things when it needed the most. Now let me tell you something that genuinely blew my mind when I first came across it. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, but the production design team works overtime to make it feel like various American cities. The reason Toronto is used is partly financial, because Canadian production incentives make large-scale television significantly cheaper to produce, but also because the city's architecture is versatile enough to double for multiple American locations with the right dressing. What's remarkable is how successfully this works. The Vought Tower, the streets, the neighborhoods, all of it has been built, dressed, and filtered to feel distinctly American in its visual language. It's a deliberate construction of a place that represents America without actually being America. Which, when you think about the show's themes around image versus reality, feels oddly appropriate. Let's get into the comic books for a second, because the relationship between the source material and the show is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent television history. Garth Ennis wrote the original boys comic series starting in 2006. He created it as a genuinely angry, frequently grotesque response to what he saw as the sanitization of superhero stories and the cultural moment of the mid-2000s. The comic does not hold back. In ways that would be essentially impossible to put directly on a streaming platform, it goes to places that are designed to make you uncomfortable on a fundamental level. When Amazon picked up the adaptation, the challenge was enormous. How do you take source material that operates at a kind of creative extreme and translate it into something that keeps the spirit, keeps the rage, keeps the satire, but also functions as prestige television that can reach a mainstream audience? Eric Kripke's answer was to treat the comic as a starting point rather than a blueprint. Significant characters were reconceived. Story arcs were restructured. Tonal adjustments were made that changed some aspects dramatically. And in many cases, the show actually deepens the ideas that the comic introduced by giving them more space to breathe and more contemporary cultural targets to aim at. The result is something that longtime comic readers often find surprising, not because the show is worse, but because it becomes its own thing with its own logic and its own distinct personality. One specific example that's worth mentioning is the character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty. In the comics, Starlight's arc is significant but differs in some important structural ways from what the show does with her. The television version of Starlight transforms into something much more central and much more emotionally resonant than her comic counterpart. She becomes the show's moral compass in a way that gives the audience someone to orient around, someone whose perspective shifts alongside theirs as the world of Vought is slowly revealed to be exactly as corrupt as the most cynical person in the room always suspected. Moriarty herself has spoken about how the character evolved significantly through the writing process, and that she had ongoing conversations with the writers about who Annie January really is beneath the superhero identity. Here's a detail that a lot of viewers miss entirely. The Seven, the elite superhero team at the center of the show, is deliberately structured to parallel the Justice League in ways that go beyond just the obvious Homelander and Superman comparison. Each member maps onto a DC icon in a way that then exposes something specific about that archetype. The Deep has elements that parallel Aquaman, complete with the complicated relationship to an underwater identity that the character is made to feel embarrassed about. Queen Maeve has Wonder Woman energy, a warrior with ancient strength who has been so thoroughly compromised by corporate machinery that she can barely remember who she was before Vought got their hands on her. A-Train has a Flash parallel, a speedster whose entire identity has been consumed by the performance of being a speedster, to the point where the performance and the person have become almost indistinguishable. By setting up these parallels, the show can then systematically interrogate every assumption that the original archetypes carry with them. What does Aquaman look like when the idea of being a sea-based hero is turned into a branding opportunity? What does Wonder Woman look like after decades of being told by men in suits how to present herself to a public that will never fully understand her? The answers are uncomfortable because they're meant to be. Now let's talk about the production side for a moment, because the practical effects work on this show deserves way more recognition than it typically gets. The Boys is famous for its shocking visual moments. The whale scene, the first episode's ending, various other sequences that viewers tend to describe in hushed, slightly traumatized tones to people who haven't seen the show yet. What most people don't realize is how much of this is achieved through a combination of practical effects and digital work that is genuinely innovative. The effects teams have won industry recognition for their work precisely because the challenge is so unusual. Most visual effects work is about making something fantastical look real. On The Boys, the challenge is often making something real look even more viscerally present than it would naturally feel. The goal isn't seamless integration. The goal is impact. The exploding heads, a recurring motif in the show, require careful coordination between the practical effects department and the digital team. The initial physics of the event is often done practically, with rigs and materials that create a genuinely physical result, and then that physical result is extended and enhanced digitally to reach the precise level of visual intensity the scene requires. It sounds technical, and it is, but the reason it matters is because you can feel it. There's a texture to the show's violence that CGI alone could never achieve, and that texture is what makes the show's horror land with such force. Let me shift to something a little more unexpected. The music supervision on The Boys is doing something genuinely clever that I think flies under the radar for a lot of viewers. The song choices in this show are not just atmosphere or tone setting. They are editorial commentary. When you hear a specific piece of music playing over a specific scene, the show is often doing something deliberately ironic or confrontational, using the cultural associations of the song to create a third layer of meaning that exists between the scene's surface narrative and its emotional subtext. The most famous example might be the use of an upbeat, familiar piece of music playing over something deeply disturbing. The contrast creates a specific emotional texture that the show has made almost a signature. But the more you watch with attention to the music, the more you realize that every choice is intentional. The showrunners have talked about spending significant time in the writer's room discussing what a particular scene's music should achieve thematically, not just emotionally. That level of deliberateness in music supervision is rare in television, and it contributes enormously to the show's distinctive feel. Now, I want to talk about something that I think represents the deepest layer of what The Boys is actually doing. And this is the part where I want you to really pay attention. The show is, at its core, about power. Specifically about what happens to people and institutions when accountability disappears. The superheroes in the world of The Boys operate with impunity not because they're evil by nature, but because the system that surrounds them has been designed to protect them from consequences. Vought doesn't just sell heroes. Vought manufactures the conditions under which heroes can do whatever they want and never face a reckoning. Sound familiar? What Kripke and his writers' room have consistently done across the show's run is update their satirical targets to reflect the specific moment in which each season was being produced and released. The show has addressed media manipulation, social media culture, the celebrity industrial complex, political extremism, corporate immunity, and the way that charisma can be weaponized against populations who are desperate for someone to believe in. These aren't background elements. They're the actual subject matter that the superhero aesthetic is being used to examine. In interviews, Kripke has been remarkably transparent about the fact that the show is political by design, not by accident. He has specifically discussed wanting to create content that could cut through the noise of an extremely saturated media environment by being so viscerally entertaining that viewers would engage with ideas they might otherwise avoid. The superheroes are the delivery mechanism. The ideas are the payload. Here's something about the casting process that I find endlessly fascinating. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the closest thing the show has to a traditional audience surrogate and everyman protagonist, was cast in part because of a quality the producers identified as essential and genuinely rare. He reads as genuinely decent. In a show populated by characters who are compromised, damaged, corrupted, or operating in moral gray zones of varying density, Huey needs to function as the viewer's point of entry. He can't be too naive or he's annoying. He can't be too savvy or he loses the quality that makes him sympathetic. Quaid threads this needle in a way that even the writers have described as unexpectedly precise. What's interesting is that Quaid comes from significant entertainment industry family background, being the son of two well-known actors, and yet his interpretation of Huey is so grounded and specific that it never feels like a legacy casting choice. He did something distinct with the character. There's a quality of performance in Quaid's work that suggests genuine investment in who Huey is as a person, and that investment pays off across the arc of the series in ways that become increasingly clear as Huey is put through more and more pressure. Let me tell you about a behind-the-scenes element that surprised me when I first learned about it. The writers' room for The Boys is unusually large and unusually diverse in its composition compared to typical cable or streaming dramas. Kripke has made specific choices about who is in that room and what range of perspectives and experiences those writers bring. This has a direct impact on the show's content in ways you might not expect. The storylines that deal with race, with gender, with sexuality, with class, are not being written from a single homogeneous perspective and then polished. They're being generated and challenged by a room full of people who have different stakes in those conversations. The result is that the show's political commentary, even when it's provocative or uncomfortable, tends to have a specificity and an accountability to it that pure satire sometimes lacks. Now let's go somewhere that I think is genuinely surprising for most viewers. The relationship between The Boys and professional wrestling is something that the creative team has acknowledged, and that is built into the show's DNA in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Professional wrestling, at its core, is about characters who are presented as real performing narratives that everyone knows are constructed, while both the performers and the audience participate in a collective agreement to engage with those narratives as if they're genuine. This is called kayfabe, and it is exactly what Vought does with superheroes. The superheroes are performing characters. The public knows on some level that they're being sold something. And yet the emotional investment is real because the need that the performance fulfills is real. Homelander's rallies have the energy of wrestling heels working a crowd. The crowd knows they're being played, but the feeling they get from the playing is genuine, and that genuine feeling is the actual product being sold. This parallel between superhero culture and professional wrestling is something the show has leaned into increasingly, and it explains a lot about why Homelander's relationship with his fan base feels so eerily familiar. Here's another production detail that's worth knowing about. Filming the Homelander laser eye sequences requires an extraordinary amount of practical on-set work that then gets enhanced in post-production. Anthony Starr has to perform in very specific physical ways with specific eye directions and facial tensions to create the base footage that the effects team can then work with. In interviews, Starr has described the experience of performing a laser sequence as requiring a kind of physical concentration that is different from regular acting work because you're committing to a physical action while knowing that the actual visible result of that action will only exist in post-production. You have to be fully present in something you can't actually see. Let's talk about Soldier Boy for a moment, because the addition of Jensen Ackles to the cast in the third season is one of the more interesting casting decisions in the show's run. Ackles came into The Boys with an enormous existing fan base from his years as Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show Eric Kripke actually created. That relationship between Kripke and Ackles spans more than a decade of creative collaboration, and the decision to bring Ackles into The Boys universe is loaded with that history. Kripke has been clear in interviews that he wanted Ackles specifically and wrote the role of Soldier Boy with that casting in mind. What's interesting about Soldier Boy as a character is that he functions as a deconstructed version of the classic American hero archetype, specifically the World War II era heroism mythology that American culture has used to construct a specific self-image. Soldier Boy is what happens when the mythology of American greatness is stripped down to its actual human components, and you have to reckon with what's actually there. Ackles' performance brings a quality that's essential to making this work. There's a genuine star presence to him, a physical confidence and charisma that makes it credible that this person could have been a symbol. And then the show systematically reveals the gap between the symbol and the reality. It's classic Boys territory but executed with particular effectiveness because the casting itself does part of the thematic work. I want to circle back to something about Homelander that I think is the most psychologically interesting aspect of the entire show. The character's core wound is not about power. It's about love. Specifically, the absence of it during the developmental period when human beings are most vulnerable to its absence. Homelander was raised in a laboratory. The people who had authority over him treated him as an asset rather than a child. He was never taught to attach to other people in a healthy way because the environment he was raised in did not permit healthy attachment. The result is a being with the power of a god and the emotional architecture of someone who never learned how to be safe. This is why Homelander's rages look the way they do. They don't look like the calculated evil of a villain who has chosen a path. They look like the eruptions of someone who has never had the internal resources to regulate the size of what they feel. When Homelander destroys something, there's a quality to it that reads as terrifyingly childlike. Not innocent. The opposite of innocent. But childlike in the sense that the proportion between the stimulus and the response belongs to someone who was never given the tools to close that gap. Anthony Starr and the writers have described working through this psychology in granular detail, specifically because they wanted Homelander to be frightening in a way that was also comprehensible. Not sympathetic necessarily, but comprehensible. Because a villain who is purely and simply evil is not as frightening as a villain whose damage you can trace back to a source. One more production element that I think is really worth highlighting. The show's costume design is doing constant visual storytelling that functions completely independently of the dialogue and the action. Every superhero costume is designed as a statement about who that character is presenting themselves to be and what that presentation is concealing. Homelander's suit is the most obvious example. It's American flags and primary colors and the visual language of classical superhero design. And it sits on a man whose interior reality is the opposite of everything those design choices are supposed to represent. The costume is a lie, and it's designed to read as one once you know the character, while still being designed to read as the real thing to the crowd. The boys' look, the working class, lived-in, practical aesthetic of their clothing and their environment, is equally deliberate. They wear what people wear when they're not performing anything, when they're just surviving. The contrast between the visual register of the superheroes and the visual register of the boys themselves is a constant silent argument the show is making about authenticity and performance. Let me give you something you can take away from this video and use the next time you're watching the show. When you watch a scene involving Homelander and a crowd of supporters, pay attention to where his eyes go when the crowd responds to something he's said. There's specific performance work in those moments. Starr has talked about playing Homelander's reaction to crowd approval as the closest thing the character ever gets to feeling genuinely fed. Not happy. Federation. Like the love of the crowd is a substance that fills something in him temporarily without ever actually nourishing him. And if you watch for that specific quality in those moments, you'll see it. It changes how the rallies feel. They stop being scenes of power and become scenes of hunger. That recontextualization is available throughout the show once you know where to look. The Boys rewards close attention in a way that a lot of action-oriented content doesn't bother to earn. The surface level is extremely entertaining on its own terms. But underneath that surface is a show that has done the work of a genuinely serious piece of culture, one that has something real and uncomfortable to say about the world that made it. Now here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated when people talk about the show's legacy. The Boys arrived at a specific cultural moment. Superhero content had reached a kind of total market saturation. Every major studio had a shared universe. Every streaming service was developing cape content. The genre had become so dominant that it was starting to collapse under its own weight, with audiences showing early signs of fatigue in a way that the studios were struggling to acknowledge. Into that moment came a show that was not anti-superhero in the simple sense of just replacing good guys with bad guys. It was something more surgically precise than that. It was a show that identified the specific psychological needs that superhero stories fulfill in their audience, and then asked what happens when those needs are exploited rather than genuinely met. That question landed because it was the right question at the right time. And it landed in a way that didn't alienate the audience who loved superheroes. It landed in a way that made that audience think more clearly about what they were loving and why. That's a difficult creative trick to pull off, and the show pulls it off consistently across its run. The show's commercial success, which has been significant, is itself a kind of argument the show is making. It became one of the most watched properties on its platform. It generated enormous cultural conversation. It spawned spin-off content. All of this happened because it was doing something that the content it was criticizing had stopped doing, which was treating its audience as intelligent adults who deserved to have genuinely challenging ideas delivered to them inside genuinely entertaining packaging. And that, ultimately, might be the most interesting fact about The Boys. Not any specific behind-the-scenes detail, not any specific performance choice, not any specific production decision, though all of those are fascinating and worth knowing. The most interesting fact is that it exists at all. That a show this angry, this political, this willing to be genuinely offensive in service of genuine ideas, found an audience of millions. That it became mainstream without becoming safe. That it influenced how the industry thinks about superhero content at exactly the moment when that influence was needed. If you've been watching this show and you've enjoyed it without fully understanding why it hits differently than everything else in the genre, I hope this video gave you some of what you were looking for. The craft is visible once you know where to look. The intentions are accessible once someone points you toward them. And the experience of going back and watching with all of this in your head is something I genuinely recommend. Because there's a version of watching The Boys where you're just along for the ride, and the ride is genuinely excellent. But there's another version where you're watching a group of extraordinarily talented people who are angry about real things using the most entertaining possible vehicle to say those things as loudly as they can. That version is better. Drop in the comments which facts surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the shows and films that are doing things that deserve more attention and more analysis, hit that subscribe button because this channel is exactly that. See you in the next one. You think you know The Boys. You've watched every season. You've picked your favorite characters. Maybe you've even gone down the rabbit hole of fan theories online. But I promise you, there are things about this show that most people have absolutely no idea about. And by the time this video is done, you're going to look at The Boys in a completely different way. We are talking behind-the-scenes secrets, wild casting decisions that almost changed everything, the real-world inspirations that are darker than anything on screen, and details hidden so deep in the show that even obsessive fans have missed them. This is the stuff the creators didn't put in the press interviews. This is the stuff that makes this show one of the most deliberately crafted pieces of television ever made. So if you think you're already a fan, buckle up, because we're about to go somewhere most boys fans have never been. Let's start with something that will fundamentally change how you watch the very first episode. The Boys was not supposed to be on Amazon. The show was originally developed elsewhere, and it bounced around for years before landing at Amazon Prime Video. Now think about what that means. The show that became one of the most transgressive, boundary-pushing series in television history almost didn't get made the way we know it. Different network, different rules, different version of The Boys. The fact that it ended up on a streaming platform with fewer content restrictions is a massive part of why the show could go as far as it did. Every moment that made your jaw drop, every scene you thought they couldn't possibly include, all of that exists because of a development journey that nearly went in a completely different direction. Now here's something about the comic book source material that casual fans don't fully appreciate. The original comic by Garth Ennis is genuinely more extreme than the show. And that's saying something. The television adaptation actually pulled back significantly on certain storylines and character arcs from the comics. Showrunner Eric Kripke and his team made deliberate choices about what to keep, what to change, and what to leave out entirely. Some of the decisions were creative, some were practical, and some were about making sure the show could actually function as ongoing television rather than a contained story with a definitive brutal endpoint. The interesting thing is that many of the changes made the show better. Characters who were one-dimensional in the comics became layered, compelling people on screen. The show's version of Homelander, for instance, became something far more psychologically complex than what appeared on the page. Speaking of Homelander, let's talk about Anthony Starr because what he does in that role is something that the casual viewer might take for granted. Starr is from New Zealand. He's playing an American character who is essentially a warped version of the American dream itself. And he does it with a precision and control that most actors simply don't have. But here's what you might not know. The physical and psychological preparation Starr put into that role went well beyond normal acting preparation. He studied the behavior of cult leaders. He researched narcissistic personality disorder extensively. He looked at charismatic figures throughout history who used charm as a weapon. The smile that Homelander uses, that unsettling smile that makes your skin crawl even when the character seems perfectly pleasant, that was a deliberate construction. Starr built that smile to represent the gap between what Homelander projects and what he actually is. Every time you see it, you're watching a performance built on months of psychological research. But here's the layer that most people miss. Starr has spoken about playing Homelander as someone who is fundamentally a child. Not a child in terms of intelligence, but a child in terms of emotional development. Someone who was raised in a lab, who was never taught how to be human, who desperately wants love but has no idea how to receive it or give it. That interpretation transforms every scene he's in. When Homelander is terrifying, it's because he's a child having a tantrum. When he's pitiful, it's because he's a child who has never shown affection. That reading of the character is built into every scene he plays, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now let's talk about Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher. Urban is from New Zealand as well, and his Cockney accent in the show is something he worked on specifically for this role. But what you might not know is the character's accent and general demeanor was actually drawn from specific real-world inspirations that go deeper than just the sound of the voice. Butcher is written as someone whose entire personality is a performance of toughness designed to mask devastating grief. The Cockney swagger, the constant aggression, the refusal to show vulnerability, it's all armor. Urban understood this and built the performance from the inside out. The accent and the attitude are things Butcher puts on every morning like a uniform. That's why the moments when the armor cracks hit so hard. You're not just watching a tough guy falter. You're watching someone's entire constructed identity start to fail. Here's something fascinating about the casting process for the show. When Amazon was putting together the ensemble, there was enormous pressure to cast the biggest possible names in the lead roles. Kripke and the producing team resisted this in specific ways because they understood something crucial about the show's psychology. The Boys works because the soup characters feel genuinely superhuman and the human characters feel genuinely human. If you fill the cast with already established movie stars, you risk the audience bringing their existing associations with those actors into the show. Some of the best casting decisions were counterintuitive precisely because they chose performers who were relatively unknown to mainstream audiences at the time. This allowed viewers to meet these characters fresh, without preconceptions. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, is a perfect example of this. Moriarty's arc across the series is one of the most demanding acting journeys in the entire show. She has to play someone who starts as genuinely idealistic, gets systematically disillusioned, and then has to rediscover what she actually believes versus what she was conditioned to believe. The emotional range required is extraordinary. And Moriarty does it while also playing opposite one of the most magnetic performers on television in Anthony Starr, which requires holding your own against an enormous gravitational pull. The fact that she was not yet a massive star when she took the role actually served the character. Annie feels like someone you might know, someone real. That groundedness was a casting choice. Let's pivot to something that doesn't get discussed enough, which is the writing room and how the show's satirical targets are chosen. The Boys has a reputation for going after corporate greed, celebrity culture, and media manipulation. But the show's writers have been remarkably open about the fact that they deliberately avoid making their satire too specifically tied to any single real-world moment. The reason is longevity. If you write an episode that is too specifically about one particular news story or one particular public figure, that episode starts to feel dated within months. The writers aim for the underlying systemic issues rather than the surface manifestations. This is why the show still feels sharp and relevant across multiple seasons. It's not satirizing the specific, it's satirizing the structural. The specific examples change. The underlying what they're pointing at does not. This is also why the show resonates with viewers across a pretty wide political spectrum, which might seem surprising given how aggressive its critiques are. Because the show isn't really attacking any particular political tribe. It's attacking the machinery of power itself, the way institutions corrupt individuals, the way celebrity becomes a tool of control, the way heroism gets manufactured and sold. These are concerns that land differently depending on your political starting point, but they land for almost everyone. Now here's something about the production design that changes how you see every frame. The world of The Boys is divided into a very specific visual language. The world of Vought and the Soups is saturated, bright, almost aggressively colorful. Everything is polished and warm and inviting. Meanwhile, the world of Billy Butcher and the Boys is desaturated, grittier, lit with cooler tones. This is not accidental. The production design team built an entire visual philosophy around the idea that the world of corporate superheroes is essentially a permanent advertisement, and the world of the people fighting them is closer to reality. When characters cross between these visual worlds, you feel it even if you don't consciously register it. Your eye is constantly being told something about where power lives and what it looks like versus where ordinary people exist. The Tower of Vought itself deserves a whole discussion. The architectural choices for that building were deeply deliberate. It's designed to evoke luxury, corporate power, and a kind of religious authority all at once. Think about the way the interior spaces are used for gatherings that function almost like worship services. The show is making a continuous argument about the relationship between corporate branding and religious devotion, and the set design embeds that argument into the physical space of the story before a single word of dialogue is spoken. Let's talk about one of the most technically demanding aspects of the show, which is the visual effects work. The Boys is not a massive tentpole film with a $500 million budget. It's a television show that has to deliver convincing superhero effects episode after episode. The way the VFX team handles this is genuinely innovative. Rather than trying to compete with Marvel or DC films on the level of spectacle, the effects work on The Boys is deliberately integrated into the tonal register of the show. The violence is visceral rather than balletic. The powers feel dangerous rather than elegant. The whale sequence, the plane sequence, certain moments in Season 3, these are not designed to be awesome in the traditional superhero sense. They're designed to be disturbing. The VFX team was given a specific brief that their work should feel wrong, not cool. That's an unusual creative direction to give a visual effects team, and the results speak for themselves. Here's something about the show's music that most people don't think about. The song choices in The Boys are not just needle drops. They are arguments. Every time the show puts a specific piece of music over a specific scene, it's making a deliberate point about the contrast between what a song means culturally and what's actually happening on screen. The use of cheerful, patriotic, or innocently nostalgic music over scenes of corporate manipulation or violence is a technique the show uses constantly. And it works because it exploits the gap between what we've been conditioned to feel when we hear certain sounds and what we are actually watching. It's essentially the same technique the show uses with superhero iconography. Take something that's supposed to make you feel safe and good. Use it to make you feel deeply uncomfortable. That's the show's whole thesis in musical form. Now let's go somewhere really interesting. The show has a complicated relationship with its own popularity. Eric Kripke has talked about this in interviews. The strange experience of making a show about the dangers of corporate manufactured heroes and watching it become a massive corporate product. The Boys merchandise exists. The Boys theme park experience has been discussed. The Boys is itself a product of Amazon, one of the largest corporations on the planet. The show is aware of this tension. There are moments of self-awareness built into later seasons that seem to directly address the irony of what the show has become. Whether that self-awareness fully resolves the tension is a question fans and critics continue to debate, but the fact that the writers are thinking about it is itself significant. Let's talk about Tomer Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background brings something extraordinary to the show. Capone is Israeli, and he came to the role with a performance approach deeply influenced by his theatrical training. Frenchie is written as a character who uses humor and flamboyance as protective mechanisms, someone who makes himself entertaining so that people will keep him around. There's a sadness underneath all of Frenchie's color that Capone communicates through physical stillness in moments when the character thinks no one is watching. It's subtle acting work in a show that often operates at maximum volume, and it creates a fascinating counterpoint. When Frenchie is quiet, you feel the weight of everything he carries. Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kimiko, had a unique challenge in the show's early seasons. Her character is non-verbal for significant stretches of the story. She communicates almost entirely through physical performance and facial expression. This is an extraordinarily demanding form of acting, and Fukuhara has spoken about studying physical performance techniques specifically to handle the role. What's fascinating is that Kimiko became one of the most beloved characters in the show despite, or arguably because of, the limitation of her early characterization. The audience projected onto her in ways they couldn't with the more vocally expressive characters. There's something psychologically interesting about how silence creates intimacy. Fukuhara's physical storytelling built a connection with viewers that some of the more dialogue-heavy characters never quite achieved. Here's a fact about the show's production schedule that puts everything in context. The Boys films in Toronto, and the production team has to essentially construct an alternative version of a major American city within a Canadian city. The locations team has to constantly find or build spaces that read as specifically American to international audiences while navigating the practical realities of what Toronto actually looks like. This involves extensive set decoration, strategic angle choices, and sometimes complete set builds. The Vought Tower exterior work required significant technical creativity to create the impression of a Manhattan-scale corporate headquarters. This kind of logistical challenge is invisible to the viewer but shapes every decision about how scenes are shot and staged. Now let's get into something that goes deeper than most fan discussions. The show's treatment of trauma is more sophisticated than it gets credit for. Nearly every major character in The Boys is operating from a place of unprocessed trauma. Butcher is grieving and cannot stop. Starlight is dealing with systemic abuse she was taught to minimize. Kimiko carries violence inflicted on her from childhood. Huey starts the show experiencing acute traumatic loss. The Deep has experienced various forms of coercion and is in profound denial about all of it. Maeve has essentially dissociated from her own life. Even Homelander, the primary antagonist, is written as someone whose evil is rooted in the violence done to him as a child by the very corporation that then deployed him as a weapon. The show doesn't use trauma as backstory decoration. It uses it as the engine of behavior. Every choice these characters make, including the destructive ones, makes sense when you trace it back to what was done to them. This is sophisticated psychological writing, and it means that even when characters do terrible things, the show maintains emotional coherence. You understand why even when you can't excuse it. Here's something about Claudia Dumas, who plays Victoria Newman, the character revealed to be a soup hiding in plain sight within the political establishment. Dumas is Australian. Her American politician performance is constructed with specific awareness of political body language and rhetoric. She and the writers built a character who represents something very specific. The idea that the most dangerous kind of power is the kind that presents itself as accountable and ordinary. Newman is terrifying not because she seems like a monster, but because she seems like a reasonable person. The audience's trust in her is deliberately cultivated so that the betrayal hits harder. Every scene where she seems sympathetic is a trap. Let's talk about Jim Beaver, who has a recurring role in the show. Beaver is best known to many audiences from his work with Eric Kripke on Supernatural. His presence in The Boys is part of a broader pattern of trust that Kripke brings to his productions. He works repeatedly with actors he's collaborated with before because he understands that part of what makes a show work is the comfort and shorthand that develops between creators and performers over time. The ensemble feel of The Boys isn't accidental. It was cultivated through deliberate choices about who was invited into the creative community around the show. Here's a technical detail about the violence in the show that most people don't think about. The gore in The Boys is specifically calibrated. The show's makeup and practical effects teams work in tandem with the VFX team to create violence that feels consequential rather than spectacular. There's a philosophy at work here. Superhero violence in mainstream media is typically presented as consequence-free. People get thrown through buildings and walk away. The Boys is fundamentally an argument against that convention. The violence in the show is designed to remind you that bodies are fragile and that power used without restraint destroys things that cannot be repaired. Every piece of practical gore is a political statement about the glamorization of violence in superhero media. Now here is something that will make you think differently about Season 1 specifically. The pilot episode of The Boys was written with the awareness that most of the audience would arrive with strong preconceptions about superhero stories. The creative team knew they needed to violate those preconceptions in the first episode with enough force to reset the audience's expectations entirely. The death that occurs in the pilot, which is one of the most shocking moments of the entire series, was specifically calibrated to happen before the audience had enough attachment to feel grief, but with enough force to feel the wrongness of it. The mechanics of that scene were discussed extensively in the writer's room. The question was, how do you make an audience understand that nothing in this world is safe without making them too emotionally distant to keep watching? The answer was precision. Hit hard enough to disrupt, but not so hard that you break the connection. Let's talk about Amazon's role in the show because it's more complicated than it appears. Amazon is the distributor and a major financier of The Boys, and the show regularly satirizes corporations that use entertainment and heroism as marketing tools. Amazon is itself a massive corporation with significant controversies around labor practices and market power. The show has made jokes and references about this tension within its own narrative. Kripke has been publicly thoughtful about the relationship, acknowledging the irony while arguing that making the show from inside the machine is part of what gives it access to the audience it needs to actually matter. Whether you find that convincing or not is a legitimate question. But the fact that the show exists in this specific tension is something that shapes every creative decision about how far the satire is allowed to go. Something that rarely gets discussed is the role of intimacy coordinators on the show. The Boys contain significant sexual content, and the production has been open about using intimacy coordinators to manage those scenes in ways that protect performers and ensure that the content serves the story rather than existing gratuitously. This is a relatively recent development in the industry, and one that represents a significant shift in how productions handle vulnerable content. The presence of this kind of professional infrastructure on set affects the quality and authenticity of what ends up on screen. Performers who feel safe are able to do their best work. Here's something about the show's international reception that's worth knowing. The Boys has a genuinely global audience, and it resonates differently in different cultural contexts. In countries with strong traditions of political satire, the show is often read as conventional in its targets, the powerful and corrupt, even when the methods are unconventional. In countries where superhero mythology has a strong cultural hold, the show is often read as more radical. In some markets, the show's critique of American corporate power and American patriotism lands as specifically anti-American in ways the creators probably didn't entirely intend. The show means different things to different audiences, and that semantic flexibility is actually part of its strength. It's a target-rich environment for interpretation. Let's get into something about the show's future and what the production team has indicated about how they plan to end things. Kripke has been clear that The Boys has a specific ending in mind. This is rarer than you'd think in television, where shows often continue beyond their natural endpoint because the economics of a successful series push toward extension. The willingness to plan and commit to an ending reflects a creative confidence that not every showrunner has, and it suggests that the final season, whenever it arrives, will be built to satisfy rather than to leave doors open for more product. Given that the show's entire philosophy is about the damage done when powerful things refuse to end, there would be a certain poetic justice in the show itself being willing to stop. Now let's talk about Gen V, the spin-off series, because it reveals something interesting about how the Boys universe is being expanded. Gen V is set at Godolphin University, a college for young soups, and it operates with a slightly different tonal register than the parent show. It's younger, more focused on identity and institutional corruption at the formative level, the damage done to people before they fully become who they're going to be. The existence of Gen V as a spin-off raises interesting questions about world building. Every expansion of a universe that works through specificity runs the risk of diluting what made the original specific. The creative challenge for Gen V was to find its own reasons for existing rather than simply being more boys. Whether it succeeded is something fans continue to debate, but the attempt itself shows an awareness of the risks of expansion. Something interesting about the casting of younger characters across both shows is the deliberate casting of performers who carry a specific kind of contemporary energy. There's an awareness in the casting choices that The Boys is a show that has to feel current, not nostalgic. The soups are a metaphor for things that are happening right now, and the people embodying those metaphors need to feel like people who exist in the present moment. Here's a detail about Homelander's costume that rewards close attention. The suit is red, white, and blue in the obvious way, but the specific design choices embed additional layers of meaning. The eagle iconography on the suit is positioned and styled in ways that evoke military insignia as much as superhero iconography. The suit is supposed to read as flag, uniform, and costume simultaneously. It's designed to trigger multiple simultaneous associations: patriotism, military authority, and performative spectacle. Every time Homelander is on screen in the suit, he's a walking argument about how those three things have become intertwined in American culture, and how the intertwining serves power rather than people. Here's something that gets at the heart of what makes The Boys work as more than just transgressive entertainment. The show takes seriously the question of what it would actually mean to have people with that kind of power in the world. Not in a wish fulfillment way, but in a what would really happen way. And the answer the show keeps returning to is that the problem is not the powers. The problem is the systems that would form around the powers. Vought is not villainous because it employed super-powered people. It's villainous because it did to super-powered people exactly what powerful institutions do to anyone they can control. It manufactured them, monetized them, and deployed them as tools of profit. The soups are not the problem. They are the product. And the real horror of the show is that the structure creating them is recognizable because it's the structure we already live in, just wearing a cape. This is the show's central psychological hook and the reason it stays with you long after you finish an episode. The Boys is not really about superheroes. It's about power and what power does to people and to the systems that accumulate it. The Supes are a thought experiment. What if the people who run things could do whatever they wanted with absolute impunity? The show's answer is not a fantasy answer. It's a realistic answer. And it's uncomfortable specifically because you recognize it. The show also takes seriously the psychology of people who oppose power. Butcher and the Boys are not heroes in any conventional sense. They do terrible things. They are motivated by grief, anger, and revenge as much as by any genuine moral principle. The show refuses to give the audience a clean protagonist to root for because clean protagonists would undermine the argument. If the good guys were genuinely good, then the message would be that individual virtue can overcome systemic corruption. The Boys doesn't believe that. It believes that the system corrupts everyone it touches, including the people fighting it. And that's a much darker and more honest argument. Here's something about the show's longevity and cultural staying power. The Boys arrived at a specific cultural moment when superhero fatigue was starting to set in among parts of the audience that had grown up with the Marvel and DC dominance of popular culture. It offered something that the mainstream superhero product couldn't: consequences, complexity, and a refusal to make you feel good about power. It essentially created a new lane in a crowded genre by being the anti-product within the product category. And the audience that was hungry for exactly that found it and made the show a phenomenon. Every fact we've covered today, from Anthony Starr's psychological research to the deliberate visual grammar of the production design to the specific calibration of the pilot's first act violence, points toward the same thing. The Boys is one of the most deliberately constructed shows on television. Nothing in it is accidental. Everything is an argument. Everything is a choice. The gap between what it looks like and what it actually is, which is the gap between glossy superhero entertainment and deeply uncomfortable social critique, is itself the whole point. And here's the final thing, the payoff for staying through all of this. The reason these facts matter is not trivia. It's not about knowing more than other fans. It's about watching the show with your eyes fully open to what it's doing. Because when you understand the intent behind the construction, every scene gets richer. Every performance gains additional dimension. Every visual choice starts to speak. The Boys is a show that rewards the kind of attention most people never give television because most television doesn't deserve that attention. This one does. So watch it again. Watch it knowing what you know now. Watch Star's smile and think about the child who has never shown love. Watch Butcher's armor and wait for the moments it cracks. Watch the saturated, warm light of Vought Tower and recognize it for what the show is telling you it is. Watch the music choices and hear the argument underneath the melody. You're not just watching a show about superheroes doing terrible things. You're watching one of the most sophisticated critiques of power and mythology that popular television has ever produced. And now you know how to see it. What if I told you that one of the most disturbing television shows ever made is actually perfect to fall asleep to? Yeah, I know that sounds completely backwards. The Boys, Amazon Prime's brutally honest superhero satire, just dropped its 4th season, and whether you've watched every episode wide awake or you're someone who loves drifting off to the sound of interesting facts and behind-the-scenes details, you are in exactly the right place tonight. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through some of the most fascinating things about the Boys season for that even hardcore fans might not know. We are going deep on the creative choices, the real-world inspirations, the actor experiences, and the little details hidden in plain sight throughout the season. No jump scares, no sudden loud moments, just a calm and thorough journey through one of the most ambitious seasons of television in recent memory. The Boys Season 4 arrived on Prime Video in June of 2024, and from the very first episode it made clear that showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had no intention of pulling any punches. The season picks up in the aftermath of the events of Season 3, with the political and social landscape of the show's universe feeling more relevant and more uncomfortably close to our own reality than ever before. That sense of uncomfortable familiarity is something the creative team has always leaned into, but Season 4 took it to an entirely different level, drawing from headlines, political movements, and cultural anxieties in ways that sparked massive conversations online. One of the most talked about aspects of Season 4 was the character of Homelander, played with terrifying brilliance by Anthony Starr. What many viewers don't realize is how much physical and psychological preparation Anthony Starr puts into each season of this show. For Season 4, Starr has spoken in interviews about the challenge of portraying a character who is simultaneously becoming more unhinged and more powerful. The writing team gave Homelander storylines that pushed the character's narcissism and need for validation to completely new extremes, and Starr had to find ways to make those moments feel authentic rather than cartoonish. The result was a performance that earned enormous critical praise, with many reviewers calling it the best work Starr has done across the entire series. Now here is something genuinely interesting about how the show handles its villain. Kripke and the writers have been very open about the fact that Homelander is deliberately designed to mirror certain real-world figures without being a direct one-to-one copy of any specific person. The goal, as the creative team has explained it, is to capture something more universal about the psychology of unchecked power, about what happens when someone with enormous capabilities is never held accountable and is constantly surrounded by people who either fear them or worship them. That psychological portrait is researched carefully, and the writers have consulted materials on authoritarian personality types, cult dynamics, and the psychology of celebrity to shape how Homelander behaves in Season 4. Speaking of research, the production team for The Boys is known for doing extraordinary amounts of homework before every season. For Season 4, the writers' room reportedly spent months studying political movements, media manipulation tactics, and corporate lobbying practices to ensure the satirical elements of the show felt grounded and specific rather than vague. This is part of why the show resonates so deeply with audiences. It is not just throwing wild ideas at the wall. Every exaggerated moment in The Boys tends to have a real-world anchor point that makes it hit harder than pure fantasy ever could. Let us talk for a moment about the production design of Season 4, because it is genuinely remarkable and not enough people discuss it. The visual world of The Boys has always been meticulously constructed to feel like our world with the volume turned up slightly. In Season 4, the design team put enormous effort into the Vought Corporation's aesthetic, expanding and deepening the visual language of what is essentially the show's central villain organization. The way Vought spaces are designed tells you everything you need to know about how the corporation sees itself. Clean, powerful, aspirational. All chrome and glass and American flags. It is visual propaganda built into architecture, and the production designers made very deliberate choices about every space Vought characters inhabit. The Seven, Vaught's flagship superhero team, got some significant changes in Season 4, and the costume and makeup departments had their hands full keeping up with the evolving nature of each character. The superhero suits in The Boys are not spandex and foam rubber. They are incredibly intricate garments made from high-quality materials that have to be both visually impressive on camera and functional enough for the actors to actually move in. Each suit reportedly takes weeks to construct and thousands of dollars worth of materials. When characters get new suit variations or when suits need to show damage and wear, the costume team essentially has to build entirely new pieces rather than simply modifying existing ones. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, had one of the most dramatically complex arcs of Season 4, and Urban has talked publicly about how much he enjoys the challenge this character presents. Butcher is a character defined by contradiction. He is brutal and manipulative and genuinely dangerous, but there is also something deeply wounded and human at his core, and Urban works hard to keep both of those things visible simultaneously. For Season 4 in particular, the writing gave Butcher storylines dealing with mortality and legacy that required Urban to bring genuine emotional weight to scenes that could easily have felt melodramatic in less skilled hands. It is the kind of writing and performance combination that elevates genre television into something that genuinely matters. Here is a detail many casual viewers miss. The Boys is actually an adaptation of a comic book series created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, published by Wildstorm and later Dynamite Entertainment between 2006 and 2012. The show has always taken significant liberties with its source material, expanding, changing, and sometimes entirely reimagining characters and storylines. By season 4, the television version has diverged so substantially from the comics that viewers who have read the original source material are often just as surprised by plot developments as those who have never picked up a single issue. This is a conscious choice by the showrunners, who wanted the series to be its own living thing rather than simply a faithful adaptation. The relationship between the comic and the show is actually a fascinating study in how source material can be honored in spirit while being radically transformed in execution. Garth Ennis, the original comics writer, has been publicly supportive of the television adaptation even though it takes the story in very different directions. Part of what makes this interesting is that Ennis himself was writing a satirical critique of superhero culture, corporate power, and American exceptionalism back in the mid-2000s, and Kripke's team has found ways to update those themes for a very different cultural moment while keeping the core provocative energy of the original work intact. Now let us drift into something a little more technical and perhaps more soothing to think about. The visual effects work on The Boys Season 4 is staggering in its scale and ambition. This is a show that requires hundreds of individual visual effects shots per episode, everything from the relatively simple removal of wires and harnesses when actors appear to be flying, to extraordinarily complex sequences involving superpowers being used in violent and creative ways. The VFX team on The Boys has grown substantially with each season as the show's ambitions have expanded, and Season 4 reportedly had one of the largest visual effects budgets of any streaming show in 2024. One of the most technically challenging aspects of the visual effects work involves scenes where multiple super-powered characters interact with each other and with environments simultaneously. Coordinating those sequences requires incredibly detailed pre-visualization work, where the entire sequence is essentially mapped out in a rough digital format before filming even begins. This previs process can take weeks or even months for particularly complex sequences, and it involves close collaboration between the directors, the stunt coordinators, the VFX supervisors, and the actors themselves. By the time a major action sequence actually gets filmed, everyone involved has essentially rehearsed it dozens of times in various forms. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most nuanced roles in Season 4. Her character has been on an extraordinary journey across the series, moving from naive idealism to hard-won cynicism to something more complicated and interesting than either of those things. Moriarty has spoken about the responsibility she feels toward this character, particularly because Annie resonates so strongly with young women in the audience who see their own experiences with disillusionment and resilience reflected in her story. Season 4 gave Moriarty material that explored new dimensions of Annie's character, and she has been clear in interviews that the collaborative atmosphere on set is a significant part of what makes those performances possible. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of its greatest strengths, and Season 4 made excellent use of the established chemistry between these performers. Shows that have been running for multiple seasons sometimes struggle to keep ensemble dynamics feeling fresh, but The Boys has consistently managed to find new combinations of characters to put in scenes together, which keeps the interpersonal dynamics from going stale. Some of the most compelling moments in Season 4 come from unexpected pairings of characters who do not often share screen time, and those moments tend to generate some of the most memorable performances of the season. Let us talk about the music for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the show's secret weapons. The Boys has always had a masterful approach to music supervision, selecting needle drops that create ironic contrast between what is being shown on screen and what is being heard on the soundtrack. Season 4 continued this tradition with some genuinely inspired choices that viewers have endlessly discussed and debated online. The selection of songs is never random. Each piece of music is chosen to add a layer of commentary to whatever scene it accompanies, and the music supervisors work closely with the directors and the showrunner to ensure that the tonal balance between horror and dark comedy is maintained throughout. The original score of the show is also worth appreciating separately from the licensed music. The composer who works on The Boys has developed a distinctive sonic palette for the series over its run, and that score is subtler than the attention-grabbing needle drops but just as carefully crafted. The orchestral and electronic elements of the score work to create a sense of unease that runs beneath even the show's lighter moments, reminding viewers that this is fundamentally a dark world even when things appear to be going well for the characters. Here is something interesting about how Season 4 was written. The writer's room for The Boys is known for being a particularly creative and collaborative space, but it is also an intense one. Kripke has described the process of breaking stories for each season as involving enormous amounts of debate, with writers pushing each other to go further and be more specific in their critiques and their character work. For Season 4, some story ideas were apparently discussed for weeks before being either refined into something that made it to screen or set aside entirely. The ideas that get cut are often just as wild as the ones that end up in the show, which gives you some sense of the creative ambition at work in that room. The political satire in Season 4 was particularly pointed, and this generated a fascinating cultural phenomenon where people across the political spectrum simultaneously claimed the show was critiquing the other side. This is actually a testament to the sophistication of the writing. The show manages to create a funhouse mirror version of contemporary politics that reflects genuinely troubling dynamics in ways that feel recognizable without being so specifically partisan that they alienate half the audience immediately. Kripke has talked about this balance in numerous interviews, describing it as one of the ongoing creative challenges of making the show. Now, as you settle in and let your breathing slow down a little, let me tell you about the filming locations for Season 4. The Boys is primarily filmed in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for various American cities throughout the show's run. The production makes extensive use of Toronto's diverse architecture and neighborhoods, along with studio work at the city's major production facilities. For Season 4, the production reportedly used a wider variety of locations than previous seasons, partly to reflect the expanding scope of the story and partly to keep the visual experience of the show feeling fresh. Location scouts for a production like The Boys have an extraordinarily detailed job, finding spaces that can plausibly represent specific American settings while also being practical for filming. The stunt work in The Boys deserves its own dedicated appreciation. The stunt coordinators on this show are responsible for designing and executing some of the most creative and violent action sequences on television, and they do so while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. For Season 4, the stunt team developed several sequences that required entirely new approaches because the specific superpowers and situations involved had never been done before on the show. This is one of the ongoing creative challenges of working on a series with an ever-expanding set of superhuman abilities. Every new power essentially requires the stunt and visual effects teams to develop new techniques. Something that casual viewers might not appreciate is how much rehearsal time goes into even relatively brief action scenes. A sequence that takes up 30 seconds of screen time might represent multiple full days of rehearsal and filming. The actors who perform their own stunts in those sequences, and several of the main cast members do quite a bit of their own stunt work, spend considerable time working with the stunt coordinators to ensure that the movements feel authentic and that they can be executed safely at the required intensity. This collaborative process between actors and stunt professionals is one of the less glamorous but genuinely fascinating aspects of how a show like this gets made. Let us take a quiet moment and think about the writing of individual episodes in Season 4. Each episode of The Boys is a complex piece of work that has to balance multiple storylines, advance character development, deliver on the show's satirical agenda, and satisfy the entertainment expectations of a very engaged and demanding audience. The writers who work on individual episodes bring different strengths to the table, and the variation in tone between episodes is often a reflection of which writer or writing team took the lead on a particular installment. Some episodes lean harder into the dark comedy, others into the horror elements, and still others prioritize emotional character work. The skill of the showrunner lies in making all of those variations feel like part of a coherent whole. The directors of Season 4 came from a variety of backgrounds, and bringing in different directorial perspectives is a deliberate strategy on prestige television productions like this one. Each director brings their own visual sensibility and interpretive approach to the material, while working within the established look and feel of the show. The challenge for directors joining an ongoing series is understanding and honoring what has come before while also bringing something genuinely fresh to their episodes. The Boys has been successful at this balancing act because the showrunners are very clear about the fundamental visual and tonal rules of the series, while also giving directors meaningful creative latitude within those parameters. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 4 was its exploration of found family dynamics, and the way that trauma shapes bonds between people. The core group of characters around Billy Butcher has always functioned as a kind of broken family, people who have been hurt by the world in specific ways and who have found each other partly out of necessity and partly out of something more genuine. Season 4 pushed these dynamics in new directions, testing the bonds between characters in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than contrived. This is the kind of emotional work that separates shows that are merely entertaining from shows that leave a lasting impression on audiences. The casting of guest and recurring characters in Season 4 was handled with particular care. The show has always made excellent use of its supporting cast, and Season 4 introduced some new characters who were received warmly by audiences and critics alike. The casting process for a show like The Boys involves finding actors who can match the very specific energy the series requires, which is a delicate combination of dramatic capability, comedic timing, physical presence, and the willingness to commit fully to material that can be quite extreme. The casting directors who work on the show have developed a strong sense of what The Boys needs from its performers, and that institutional knowledge shows in the consistency of the casting quality. Here is a softer detail to think about as you drift. Many of the props used throughout Season 4 contain hidden details and jokes that are invisible at normal viewing distance and often only caught by audience members who pause their screens or watch extremely carefully. The production design team puts enormous effort into creating a fully realized fictional world, and that includes populating that world with fake advertisements, fake news broadcasts, fake social media posts, and fake product packaging that all contain jokes and Easter eggs. Some of these details reference previous events in the show's history, others are pure jokes for their own sake, and finding them has become a beloved activity for the show's most dedicated fan community. The fan community around The Boys is itself a fascinating cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The show has generated one of the most active and creative fan communities in contemporary streaming television, with fans producing art, fan fiction, analysis essays, video essays, and detailed annotation of each episode that sometimes reveals details the creators themselves had forgotten including. The relationship between the show and its fan community has been notably warm, with Kripke and many of the cast members being quite active on social media and engaging with fan responses to episodes. This kind of creator-to-audience dialogue has become more common in the streaming era, but The Boys has made it particularly central to how the show exists in the culture. Season 4 dealt extensively with themes of legacy, specifically the question of what people leave behind and whether any individual action can meaningfully change large structural problems. These philosophical questions are embedded in the plot and character work, but they are never stated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from the specific situations the characters find themselves in and the choices they make under pressure. This is sophisticated thematic writing, and it is part of why the show is taken seriously as social commentary rather than dismissed as simply extreme content for shock value. The balance between extreme content and genuine emotional depth is one of the defining creative achievements of The Boys as a series. The show contains material that is genuinely difficult to watch, scenes of violence and cruelty that are designed to be disturbing rather than exciting. But those moments are always placed in a context that gives them meaning, that connects them to the larger arguments the show is making about power and accountability and human nature. The writers have been clear that they do not include extreme content for its own sake, but rather to make points that gentler storytelling could not make as effectively. Whether viewers agree with those creative choices is a matter of personal taste, but the intentionality behind them is not really in question. Now let us settle even further into something quieter. Think about the editing of Season 4, which is a craft that operates largely invisibly when it is working correctly. The editors on The Boys are responsible for assembling the footage from multiple filming days into coherent scenes, then assembling those scenes into episodes, and working closely with the showrunner and directors to ensure that pacing, tone, and emphasis are all hitting the intended targets. Season 4 reportedly went through significant editing work in post-production, with some sequences being substantially reworked based on early screenings and feedback. This kind of iterative editing process is common on prestige television, and the willingness to keep refining material until it works is part of what distinguishes these productions from lower-budget work. The sound design of The Boys is another element that rarely gets the appreciation it deserves. The sound team is responsible for creating an immersive audio environment that makes the superhero violence feel real and grounded rather than cartoonish. This involves creating original sound effects for things that have no real-world equivalent, things like specific superpowers being used in specific ways. The sound designers draw from enormous libraries of recorded sounds and combine and transform them to create new sonic textures. Season 4 had some particularly impressive sound design moments, where the audio work was doing as much emotional work as the visuals. One thing that has been noted by critics and viewers alike about Season 4 is how well it developed its female characters in particular. The show has always taken the experiences of its female characters seriously, using their storylines to examine specific forms of power imbalance and exploitation that are distinct from what the male characters face. Season 4 expanded on this, giving characters like Starlight, Kimiko, and others material that felt both specific to their established personalities and genuinely surprising in its emotional depth. The writers who worked most closely on these character arcs have spoken about doing deliberate research to ensure these storylines felt authentic rather than exploitative. The character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, has one of the show's most distinctive communication challenges because the character does not speak. All of Kimiko's emotional expression has to come through physical performance and context, which is a genuinely difficult acting challenge that Fukuhara handles with remarkable skill. Season forgave Fukuhara material that expanded the emotional range of this character in ways that were visually inventive and emotionally resonant, and the work she does is consistently cited by critics as one of the show's underappreciated strengths. Let the thoughts drift a little now, like leaves moving slow across water. The Boys is a show that asks its audience to sit with discomfort, to recognize things about the world we live in reflected in its distorted mirror, and to keep watching even when what is being shown is not pleasant. That is a challenging proposition, and the fact that millions of people have accepted that invitation season after season speaks to something real about the quality and the relevance of the work. Season 4 deepened that relationship with its audience, delivering a season that was darker and more emotionally ambitious than its predecessors while never losing the irreverent energy that made the show compelling in the first place. There is something worth appreciating about how long-form television storytelling works at its best. Characters in a series like The Boys develop over years of audience time, and the cumulative emotional weight of that development means that moments in Season 4 land with a force that would be impossible to achieve without everything that came before. When a character makes a choice that reflects who they have become over 4 seasons of story, the impact of that moment is multiplied by all of the history the audience brings to it. This is the specific gift of serialized storytelling, and The Boys uses it with genuine sophistication. As you settle deeper and the words become more like soft sounds than things you have to actively process, consider this. The people who make The Boys, the writers and directors and actors and designers and visual effects artists and editors and everyone else in the enormous collaborative enterprise that produces a season of television, are doing work that they clearly care about deeply. The ambition and craft on display in Season 4 is not the product of cynical commercial calculation alone. There is genuine artistic investment in the show, a belief that it matters, that what it says about power and accountability and human nature is worth saying, and worth saying well. The Boys Season 4 is not perfect television. No season of any show is. But it is television that takes its audience seriously, that trusts viewers to engage with complex material and to follow character arcs through genuine darkness towards something that feels, if not exactly hopeful, then at least honest about the world. That combination of entertainment and purpose is rarer than it should be, and when it works, it is worth appreciating. So let those thoughts settle now. The Vought Towers gleaming in the fictional skyline. The complicated people doing complicated things in a world that feels uncomfortably familiar. The enormous craft and effort that goes into every frame. All of it can rest quietly at the edges of awareness now as your breathing slows and the night gets quieter around you. The Boys will be there when you wake up, ready to be watched with full attention, but for now, let the facts and the details and the appreciation for good work done carefully drift you gently towards sleep. Season 4 delivered. The people who made it cared. And that is a comforting thought to carry into rest. Look, I've watched The Boys probably 3 times through at this point, and every single time I think I've figured it all out, something new hits me. A piece of trivia, a behind-the-scenes detail, a connection I completely missed. And I know I'm not alone in that because this show has one of the most obsessive fan bases on the entire internet. So today we are going digging. Deep. We are going places the subreddits haven't fully explored, pulling back the curtain on production secrets, character decisions, wild real-world inspirations, and details so small they had to be intentional. By the end of this video, I promise you will see the boys completely differently. Let's get into it. So let's start with something that will immediately reframe how you think about the entire show. Garth Ennis, the comic book writer who created The Boys back in 2006, has openly admitted that he wrote the original story as a direct response to his frustration with the superhero genre itself. He wasn't a fan. Genuinely not a fan of the direction Marvel and DC were taking things. He thought superheroes had become these sanitized, corporate mascots that companies use to push merchandise and maintain a stranglehold on popular culture. So he created a comic that was essentially the most violent, disgusting, disturbing deconstruction of that world he could possibly imagine. But here's the fascinating part. When Amazon picked it up for television, the showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had to figure out how to adapt material that was, in many places, genuinely unpublishable in terms of mainstream content. And the direction they chose was to make the satire smarter, more pointed, more directly connected to real-world corporate and political power structures. The show became less about gross shock value and more about something that actually made audiences uncomfortable for intellectual reasons. That's a massive creative pivot, and it changed everything about what the boys became. Now let's talk about Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, because the performance choices he made for that character are so calculated it borders on scary. Starr has talked in interviews about how he approached Homelander not as a villain but as a deeply traumatized individual who happens to have the power of a god and zero emotional regulation. He spent a lot of time thinking about what it would actually do to a human psyche to never have experienced genuine love or connection as a child, to have been raised in a laboratory environment where you are simultaneously the most powerful being on the planet and completely powerless over your own life. The laser eyes, the flying, the invincibility, none of that is what makes Homelander terrifying. What makes him terrifying is that smile. Starr worked specifically on what he called the mask, this performance of warmth and charm that Homelander deploys publicly, and the way that mask slips when he's alone or when he feels genuinely threatened. If you go back and watch early Season 1 scenes knowing that framework, it completely transforms what you're watching. You start catching these micro-expressions, these tiny moments where the mask flickers. It's genuinely one of the most technically brilliant performances in television history, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Jumping over to Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, and there's a detail here most people don't know. Urban is from New Zealand, and Butcher is written as a British character, specifically from London. Urban has a natural New Zealand accent, which is nothing like a London working-class accent. The preparation he put into that accent was extensive, and Urban has said that the voice, the way Butcher speaks, became the key to unlocking the entire character for him. The accent wasn't just cosmetic. It was psychological. Because when you adopt a completely different voice, a different rhythm of speaking, a different way of landing words, you actually start thinking differently. Urban described it as finding a character from the outside in, which is the opposite of how most actors approach a role. Most people find the internal emotional truth first and let the external details follow. Urban built the shell and discovered who Butcher was by living inside that shell. And honestly, it works. There's never a moment where Butcher feels like Carl Urban playing dress-up. He feels like a completely real, completely separate human being. Here's one that genuinely blew my mind when I first found it. The character of A-Train, who is the seventh speedster and who the show uses to explore themes of racial inequality, celebrity, and exploitation, was actually developed with a very specific real-world parallel in mind. The creators drew heavily from the history of black athletes in American professional sports, particularly from the early to mid-20th century, when black performers and athletes were welcomed into white entertainment spaces as long as they were providing value, and then discarded or diminished the moment their utility expired. A-Train's entire arc, especially in the earlier seasons, is essentially a metaphor for that dynamic translated into a superhero context. He's fast enough to be useful to Vought, presentable enough to be marketable, but never given genuine power within the organization. And the moment his heart condition threatens his usefulness, the corporation moves to replace him without a second thought. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has talked about how much that historical context shaped the way he played the character's specific brand of internal conflict, that tension between knowing you're being exploited and still wanting to be in the room because the alternative is worse. Let's shift gears and talk about the production design for a second, because this is something that almost never gets discussed but is absolutely wild. The Vought Tower set, which is essentially the corporate headquarters of the entire show's antagonist structure, was designed with deliberate architectural references to real-world buildings associated with American corporate and media power. We are talking about things like the visual language of Trump Tower in New York, the aesthetic of certain Fox News studio spaces, and the broader vocabulary of glass and steel and gold that American wealth uses to signal dominance. Every detail in that set, from the color palette to the proportions of the lobby to the way natural light is managed, was chosen to evoke a specific feeling in viewers on a subconscious level. The idea was that audiences should feel vaguely uncomfortable in that space even when nothing bad is technically happening on screen. Production designer Arv Graywall and his team were essentially using architecture as psychological manipulation, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Vought itself does throughout the show. The set mirrors the company's methods. That level of thematic coherence in production design is genuinely rare. Now here's something about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, that I think completely changes how you appreciate her performance. When Moriarty came into the role, she made a very specific decision about Annie's relationship to her own powers. In a lot of superhero stories, the powers are the exciting part, the thing the character is proud of and wants to show off. Moriarty decided that for Annie, the powers are actually a source of deep ambivalence. They're connected to her mother's ambitions for her, to a childhood where she was trained and shaped and molded rather than simply loved. So whenever you see Starlight using her abilities, particularly in the earlier seasons, watch Moriarty's face in the moments right before and right after. There's this flicker of something complicated, something that isn't quite pride or excitement. It's closer to resignation. She's doing what she was made to do, and she's not sure whether that's a good thing. That's an incredibly subtle choice that never gets stated explicitly in the dialogue, but it's there in almost every scene where the powers appear. Speaking of things hidden in plain sight, let's talk about the Deep, played by Chase Crawford, and the specific way the show handles his storyline as a commentary on something very real and very dark. When we first meet the Deep, he commits an act of sexual harassment against Starlight in his first substantial scene. The show doesn't gloss over this. It doesn't make him a cartoon villain because of it. Instead, it then proceeds to show us in excruciating detail the way that someone with power can commit harm and then essentially coast through the institutional protection that power provides. The Deep is demoted, sent to a smaller market, publicly embarrassed, but never actually held fully accountable in any meaningful way. He retains his celebrity. He retains his powers. He retains access to the same circles of power that enabled his behavior in the first place. The writers have confirmed that this arc was directly inspired by the patterns that emerged from the Me Too movement's exposure of how power structures protect predators through partial accountability, enough consequence to create the appearance of justice, not enough to actually change anything. All right, now we're going to get into some production facts that are just objectively insane. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which means that the version of America you see in The Boys is actually built from scratch on Canadian soil. The attention to detail required to make Toronto feel like it could be anywhere in the United States is genuinely staggering. We are talking about extensive set dressing, prop work, and location scouting to find the right buildings and streets and spaces. But there's a layer to this that's almost poetically fitting. The Boys is a show about how America presents a carefully constructed image of itself to the world, an image of heroism and freedom and exceptionalism that masks something much uglier underneath. And the version of America in the show is itself a carefully constructed image built in a completely different country. The artificiality of the production location mirrors the artificiality of the world it's depicting. Whether that's intentional or just a happy accident of budget and tax incentives, I genuinely do not know. But it's hard not to find that meaningful. Let's talk about Compound V for a second, because the mythology around it in the show is based on something that might surprise you. The idea of a substance that can confer superhuman abilities, that is addictive, that corporations would kill to control, and that has unpredictable and sometimes devastating effects on people who receive it, draws on a very real historical tradition of pharmaceutical and medical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Kripke and the writers have pointed specifically to the history of unethical medical trials, the use of prisoners, soldiers, and people without full informed consent as test subjects for experimental treatments and drugs. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, exists because these things actually happened. Compound V is a fictional substance, but the power dynamics around it, the secrecy, the corporate motivation, the exploitation of people who have no real choice, those are pulled directly from documented history. The show is asking you to recognize the real world in its fictional horror, which is what the best satire always does. Now I want to talk about something that almost never comes up in discussions of this show, which is the music supervision. The Boys has an absolutely impeccable soundtrack, and the song choices are never accidental. The show uses a technique where it deliberately selects music that creates ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. You'll hear a warm, nostalgic classic rock track playing over something genuinely horrific, or a cheerful pop song accompanying something morally devastating. This isn't just for shock value. It's designed to replicate the experience of consuming corporate media. Think about it. When you watch a feel-good advertisement for a massive corporation, the music is warm and human and emotional. It's designed to make you associate positive feelings with the brand, regardless of what that corporation might actually be doing. The Boys uses that same trick but inverts your awareness of it. You're hearing the manipulation as it happens and recognizing it, which is the entire point of the show. The music supervision team on this show deserves so much more recognition than they receive. Here's a fact about Jensen Ackles joining the show as Soldier Boy that most people know, but what fewer people know is the specific context of why his casting was so narratively brilliant. Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester in Supernatural, which was also created by Eric Kripke. So when Ackles shows up in The Boys playing a character who is essentially a corrupted, toxic version of the heroic archetype, a character who represents everything dangerous about old-school American masculine mythology, there's a layer of meta-commentary happening that the audience can feel even if they don't fully articulate it. The man who spent over a decade as television's most beloved monster-fighting hero is now playing the monster. The hero has been revealed as a legacy of violence and ego and entitlement that has been sustained by nostalgia and institutional power rather than actual virtue. Kripke has been pretty coy about how intentional this casting choice was in terms of that meta layer, but it's hard to believe it wasn't at least part of the conversation. Let's switch to something about the show's approach to religion, because this is an area where the writing is actually a lot more sophisticated than it gets credit for. The Boys doesn't simply mock religion. That would be easy and cheap. What it actually does is examine the relationship between genuine faith and institutional power. Many of the show's characters who have sincere religious beliefs, like Annie at the beginning of her arc, are depicted with real empathy. Their faith is shown as authentic and meaningful. What the show skewers is not belief itself, but the way that organized religious institutions and corporate entities co-opt the language and aesthetics of faith to consolidate power and control populations. Vought doesn't hate religion. Vought loves religion because religion is an existing system for generating loyalty and compliance, and Vought is very good at plugging into existing systems. That distinction, between faith as a genuine human experience and religion as a corporate tool, is one of the most intellectually honest things about a show that is otherwise extremely comfortable being over the top. Now here's something about the stunt work and action choreography that I think deserves way more attention. The show has a philosophy about superhero violence that is directly opposed to most of the genre. In Marvel and DC films, superhero violence is typically presented as spectacular and consequence-free. Cities get destroyed, people get thrown through buildings, and the emotional register is excitement and awe. In The Boys, physical violence is almost always presented as grotesque, chaotic, and deeply human in its horror. When someone gets hurt in this show, it looks and sounds and feels like something terrible has happened to a real person. The action choreography team specifically works to strip away the cinematic glamour that usually surrounds superhero combat. The goal is to make you feel the wrongness of what you're watching rather than the excitement of it. This is why the show's most violent scenes are so hard to look away from even when they're deeply uncomfortable. It's not spectacle. It's something closer to tragedy. Here's a wild behind-the-scenes fact that connects the show to real-world corporate behavior in a way that feels almost too on the nose. During the production of one of the seasons, Amazon, which is of course the streaming platform that produces The Boys, a show that is fundamentally a critique of massive corporate power and the way corporations exploit people, was simultaneously being criticized for its own labor practices and working conditions for warehouse employees. The fact that a show this pointed in its corporate satire is produced by and generates profit for one of the world's most powerful corporations was not lost on Kripke, who has made somewhat joking but also not entirely joking comments about the irony. He's referred to The Boys as being like a band that gets to play the most rebellious punk music possible on the biggest stage in the world, which is either an amazing creative situation or a profound example of exactly the kind of co-optation the show is criticizing. Possibly both simultaneously. Let's talk about the character development pipeline, specifically how the writer's room approaches the evolution of characters across seasons. One of the things that makes The Boys distinctive is that character arcs are not written to be inspirational in the traditional sense. In most television, even dark television, characters generally move toward growth, toward healing, toward some version of being better. The Boys is genuinely committed to the idea that trauma, systemic pressure, and power do not produce better people. They produce people who are broken in different configurations. Characters don't get better in this show. They get different. Sometimes they get worse. Sometimes they make genuine progress only to be dragged back by circumstances. This is psychologically much more realistic than most television's version of character development, and it's also significantly more depressing, which is part of why the show feels so heavy even when it's being darkly funny. Something I want to address that almost never comes up is the show's treatment of its female characters, particularly in how it handles the relationship between femininity and power. Shows like this can fall into the trap of depicting female power as simply masculine power in a female body, women who are strong because they fight and dominate and refuse to be soft. The Boys does something more interesting. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, and even in her warped way Stormfront, wield power in ways that are explicitly connected to their identities as women. The way they're expected to perform femininity for the public, the way their power is always filtered through public perception of their gender, the way they're simultaneously hypervisible and dismissed. The show understands that power looks different when you're a woman in a patriarchal system, not because women are less powerful, but because the system creates entirely different constraints and leverage points. That's a nuanced take that a lot of supposedly progressive shows don't actually achieve. Let's get into some specific scene details that were loaded with meaning most viewers might have missed on first watch. There's a scene in Season 2 where Homelander stands alone on a rooftop and talks to his own reflection in a window. On the surface, it looks like a moment of narcissism, which it is, but it's also something more specific. The writers were drawing on a psychological concept related to object permanence and attachment. Homelander, who was raised in a lab and denied normal human bonding, learned to relate to himself as his primary attachment figure. The reflection isn't just vanity. It's him talking to the only entity that has been consistently present in his life. That's a deeply sad read on what superficially appears to be a menacing and self-absorbed moment, and the show gives you just enough to put it together if you're paying attention, but never explains it for you, which is the right call. Here's something about the show's writer's room that fundamentally shaped what The Boys became as a piece of storytelling. Kripke made a deliberate decision to hire writers from very different backgrounds, not just television writers but people with roots in journalism, political commentary, comedy, and long-form fiction. The goal was to bring in perspectives that weren't shaped by the conventions of how superhero stories are typically told. When your writer's room includes people who think about power and media and corporate influence professionally, rather than just narratively, the critique in the show gets sharper and more specific. You end up with storylines that feel like they were written by people who actually understand the mechanisms of the things they're criticizing, not just people who understand how to create the feeling of critique for entertainment purposes. All right, let me hit you with some rapid-fire facts that are individually smaller but collectively paint this picture of just how dense and deliberate this show is. The name Vought International was chosen specifically because of its sound. It has that heavy, slightly military feel that evokes American industrial power. The number 7 in the 7 is a deliberate reference to the Justice League, the classic DC team that has 7 core members, and the show's 7 are essentially designed as dark mirror versions of those archetypes. Homelander is Superman gone wrong. The Deep is Aquaman with the societal awkwardness dialed to maximum. Queen Maeve is Wonder Woman filtered through a story of crushed idealism. These parallels are there to make you uncomfortable in a very specific way, because you grew up loving those characters, and the show is asking you to look at what the real-world version of that kind of power might actually produce. The compound that houses Vaught's most classified experiments was deliberately designed to echo the aesthetic of mid-century American government institutions, specifically the visual language of agencies like the CIA in their early years. The architecture of secrecy, the fluorescent lighting, the beige hallways, the bureaucratic mundanity of evil. The show understands that the most frightening things don't look frightening. They look like offices. Let me also talk for a second about the show's international expansion, because the spin-off content, like Gen V and what's been developed for other markets, represent something genuinely interesting about how the franchise is growing. Rather than simply exporting the American version of corporate superhero satire to other countries, the spin-offs are designed to engage with how the specific dynamics of power, celebrity, and institutional corruption manifest in different cultural contexts. Gen V, which is set in a university context, takes the show's themes and applies them to the specific American anxiety around academic institutions, meritocracy mythology, and the ways that young people are shaped and exploited by systems that claim to be developing their potential. It's the same critique applied to a different institution, which is the right way to expand a franchise that's fundamentally about how institutions work. One more deep dive before we get to the end, and this one is about something that operates almost entirely below the level of conscious recognition for most viewers. The sound design of The Boys is doing a tremendous amount of work in every scene. The way the show mixes ambient corporate sound, the hum of fluorescent lights, the ambient noise of the city, the specific acoustic quality of different spaces, is used to create subliminal feelings of unease or comfort or confinement. The Vought Tower interior sounds different from the street-level world of Butcher and The Boys, and those sonic differences are there to reinforce the class and power distinctions the show is dramatizing. When you're inside the system, it sounds a certain way. When you're outside it, it sounds different. Most viewers will never consciously notice this, but they'll feel it, and that feeling shapes how they interpret everything that happens in those spaces. There's something I want to close on that I think is the most important fact about The Boys that almost nobody talks about, which is that the show is ultimately about the relationship between audiences and the stories they consume. Every time you watch a superhero movie and feel the dopamine hit of the hero winning, of justice being served, of the good guys triumphing, you're participating in a kind of mass cultural experience that The Boys is trying to make you think critically about. Not because there's anything wrong with enjoying those stories, but because those stories shape our expectations of what power should look like and how justice should work. And when those expectations meet the real world, they can leave us confused and unprepared for how messy and ambiguous and institutional actual power is. The show is asking its audience to be smarter consumers of the stories they're told. Not to stop enjoying stories, but to understand that stories always have an agenda, whether that's the explicit propaganda of Vaught's superhero media machine or the subtler agenda of the actual entertainment industry producing the content you watch for relaxation. That's a genuinely challenging and uncomfortable thing to sit with, which is exactly why The Boys keeps you coming back. The fact that a show this intellectually pointed has become one of the most watched programs in streaming history is either a sign that audiences are hungry for this kind of challenge, or it's the most elaborate example of the show's own themes playing out in real time. A piece of revolutionary content being consumed at massive scale, generating profit for a corporation, becoming another piece of the entertainment machine it claims to critique. Maybe both things are true. Maybe that tension is the whole point. Kripke might be the most honest person in the room, making art about the room he's standing in while fully acknowledging that he's standing in it. The Boys isn't just a show about superheroes being terrible. It's a funhouse mirror held up to every system of power we've decided to trust. And if you weren't already watching it with that frame in mind, I hope this video changed that for you. There's so much more to find in every single episode when you know what to look for. If you dug this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe because I go this deep on shows, films, and stories all the time, and this is genuinely just the tip of the iceberg. Drop in the comments what detail from the show you think most people sleep on. I read all of them and I want to know what you've caught that I might have missed. I'll see you in the next one.